Fourth quarter of 2020 after upping provisions for soured loans by $850 million. Its share buyback program starts next Tuesday. Matt?
Let's take a look at futures right now, looking at gains across European equity index futures after the U.S. hit records yesterday. Asia stocks rallied, and now we're looking at, although not huge on the FTSE, only about 0.2%. DAX futures up about 0.75%. Let's pull up the global macro movers screen. We can look at a series of risk assets here. Equity indexes in the left-hand corner, and that in the left-hand column, I should say, and that will populate as they open up. You can see the FTSE already open up 0.25%. The IBEX gaining a little bit more than 0.5% in Madrid, and we do expect the continental indexes to do better today than the FTSE, at least at the open this morning. Here you can see the CAC 40, for example, opening up 0.75%. So European markets are higher in general on continued hopes for more stimulus. Cleveland Fed President Loretta Mester told Bloomberg's Kathleen Hayes that more fiscal action wouldn't prompt the Fed to pull back.
I don't really see it impacting the need for monetary policy to be there to support the recovery, because I don't think we're going to be necessarily back to our goals in short stead. I think this is a real journey, not a sprint.
Loretta Mester there speaking exclusively to us. Joining us now for more is Emer Daly, Macquarie Bank FX strategist. Emer, we keep seeing, these risk-on rallies, weaker dollar, even on the day of and the days after. The U.S. president directed an angry mob towards Capitol Hill. Do you think that has any bearing on the market here, or are investors just looking through this at the blue wave?
Yeah, I think interestingly, markets have gone completely numb to Trump and his antics. So we didn't see much of a reaction at all, actually, in terms of the US phase. Markets are very much forward-looking. So we're now looking towards, an unconstrained Democratic presidency and what that means. And I think markets at the moment are very torn in terms of, does it mean increased fiscal stimulus and for higher US yields and a less positive environment for broad risk assets in EM? Or does it mean that, more regulatory burden, more tax burden, and that really accelerates outflow out of US stocks and into its international peers? I think at the moment they're falling on the latter. We see the market very much focused on the US 10-year yield.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? The focus on the interest rate differential, good morning to you, Emer, rather than other matters. I was reading a story today, though, that was talking about US dollar hegemony and how long that endures any mishandling of the coronavirus. And we've certainly seen that from a number of Western governments. And I wonder whether any of that does start to stick to the dollar, maybe not in a sort of day-to-day trading sense, but more structurally, more thematically, more over a longer period of time. Does any of that stick to the US dollar and lead to a search for other default currencies, if you like?
Yeah, I certainly think you want to have, a very solid governance structure and political order when it comes to having a reserve currency. Where I think most are kind of looking at Trump as your outlier president. He certainly wasn't, of Washington. He wasn't part of the U.S. establishment, and people kind of put him down to a bit of an outlier. So I don't think it kind of jeopardizes the dollar's reserve status long term, as long as, in the incoming administration, we see kind of more conventional policies, more stability in policies, and more certainty coming through.
What kind of, a lot of people have talked about the fact that although the Democrats control the Senate, there's not a huge degree of control. All you need is one or two Southern Dems to stop a Biden initiative. So what kind of initiatives do you expect the president to push through, say, in the first year?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It is a razor thin majority that they have in the Senate. I think for us, the immediate impact is more fiscal stimulus. And also now that we have, all three parts of the U.S. Governance structure, all Democrat, we actually see an end to bipartisanship and, breaking down and constraints. So you could argue this is just broadly positive, that we are going to see more kind of consensus, more policy coming through. One of the reasons why Trump, was able to do U.S. corporate tax reform when he first came into power was because all the different branches of the U.S. government were aligned in terms of having that Republican sweep. So actually, in effect, you could argue that, having broad Democrats in charge means there's kind of less, downside tail risk, that we won't see, fiscal spending cliffs. We won't see kind of constraints on policy coming through. So it could mean kind of more coherent U.S. policy.
What does the Fed do through this then, Ema? Because, we didn't really get to talk much about Fed minutes this week, of course, because of the violence we were seeing on Capitol Hill, and that's where everybody's focus was. But we see a number of Fed officials talking about tapering. At the same time, we see the likes of the Fed's Mester speaking to Bloomberg, saying that more fiscal action won't justify Fed pullback. How do we interpret comments from the Fed at this point about how accommodative their policy will be?
Yeah, I think this is the really key thing at the moment, and it's what we're looking for in terms of direction for the U.S. Treasury yield. So I think, what we need to see from the Fed now is, a guarantee that we'll continue to have accommodative policy. There was a few comments, I know Bostic said it during the week, about the potential to have tapering in 2021. I think the Fed will be very cognizant of what the financial market impact could be and the risk of having a taper tantrum, in order to kind of re-enter those kind of short dollar EM trades, which are so popular coming into this year. We need to make sure, there's not a continued push higher in the U.S. Treasury yields.
Ema, thanks very much. Stay with us. Ema Daly, Macquarie Bank FX strategist, stays with us a little bit longer here on the European market open. A quick check on the share price of Credit Suisse. The Swiss bank this morning flagging an expected loss in the fourth quarter, and as a result of that, we see some weakness in the share price. It is down around 1.5% right now, even though there had been some who'd suggested a loss was possible based on previous statements from the business. But still, that announcement on provisions for residential mortgage-backed securities having an impact on the stock this morning. Coming up on the program, Trump concedes that there will be a handover of power. He promises a smooth transition as calls for his removal and impeachment mount. More on that next. This is Bloomberg. Back to the European market open, nearly 10 minutes into our European equity session. European equity markets making gains up around 0.75% on the Stoxx 600. In particular, the gains coming from continental European markets rather than here in London. Let's get a Bloomberg Business Flash. Here are some of the top corporate stories that we're covering today at Bloomberg. Blackstone is working with Bill Gates on a potential buyout of Signature Aviation. Gates' Cascade Investment is the biggest shareholder, owning about 19%. The deal could value the world's biggest operator of private jet bases at $4.3 billion. Signature also said the Carlyle Group is considering an offer, suggesting a potential bidding war. Elon Musk is now the richest person in the world. He's overtaken Amazon founder Jeff Bezos, who's held the top spot since 2017. Musk is now worth nearly $195 billion. He's added over $165 billion of that in the last year. It's due to a massive surge in shares for his car maker Tesla, which has gained over 23,000% since its IPO in 2010. Boeing has reached a $2.5 billion settlement over the charge that it defrauded the U.S. government by concealing information about the 737 MAX. It caps a 2-year criminal investigation into the jet involved in 2 fatal crashes that killed 346 people. Boeing CEO Dave Calhoun says the company fell short of its own values. That is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Matt?
President Trump has promised a smooth transition of power after finally admitting that Joe Biden will take office on January 20th, although he gave nothing even close to a concession. He still insists that he didn't lose the election. His comments came after his supporters stormed the U.S. Capitol. He sent them there, overwhelming police barricades and breaking into the building. In the end, 5 people died, including a police officer.
A new administration will be inaugurated on January 20th. My focus now turns to ensuring a smooth, orderly, and seamless transition of power.
For more, Bloomberg's Bruce Einhorn joins us to talk about, well, first of all, Bruce, what are we hearing from congressional leaders? What kind of consequences would, inciting a mob to insurrection actually have for a sitting U.S. president?
Well, we have heard from the leaders of the Democrats, Nancy Pelosi in the House and Chuck Schumer in the Senate. They have called for Vice President Pence to use the 25th Amendment to take over from President Trump. They've said that if Vice President Pence does not do that, then they would follow through with impeachment proceedings. Whether there's enough time to get anything like either one of these options done, though, remains to be seen. We only have 13 days.
Yeah, exactly. Right, yeah, time is of the essence, perhaps, then, Bruce. There are reports that President Trump is considering pardoning some involved and also himself. How can a self-pardon work?
Well, that's a good question, and no one's really sure if it does. It's never happened before, so we've never had it tested, the idea that a president can pardon himself. The Constitution says that a president has the power to pardon for any crimes against the United States, in other words, any federal crimes. On the other hand, a lot of people, constitutional experts, argue that clearly the founders did not intend the president to be able to be above the law, which would be the consequence of him being able to pardon himself. So if the president were to do this, the question then would be, what would the Biden administration's Department of Justice do? Because unless such a pardon were tested in court, we wouldn't know whether it was valid or not.
Bruce, thanks very much. Bloomberg's Bruce Einhorn with the latest on the developments on Capitol Hill. We'll continue to watch as we progress towards January the 20th, of course. Ema Daly, Macquarie Bank FX strategist, is still with us. And Ema, as we've been saying, the markets, well, you said in your words, the markets have become numb to some of the politics, to some of what President Trump gets up to, but certainly not numb to expectations of further fiscal stimulus from a Biden administration. And that's not just constrained to the dollar, is it? If we look at the FX universe, some of the commodity currencies may be benefiting from expectations expectations of fiscal largesse. Where do you prefer to put money in that theme?
Yeah, I think, the commodity plays a really stronger story. Obviously, we're seeing kind of the dollar direction a little bit conflicted at the moment. But I think, going, say, for example, short dollar against the ruble is a really good play, because it's backed by that stronger commodity aspect. And obviously, we had, Saudi Arabia announcing an oil production cut. So that's also kind of feeding into that stronger commodity story, and also just on a general kind of global reflation as monetary policy looks to remain very easy for the rest of 2021.
Does the COVID crisis have an effect on any currency pairs you're watching? I mean, I think of when we talk about commodity currencies, the Rand in South Africa is having a terrible time of getting vaccines. Does the pandemic affect the pairs that you watch?
Yeah, we've really seen ZAR being one of the biggest underperformers, and it was always kind of the most closely correlated with equities, and it really kind of benefited on this story of, a return to normalcy and the vaccine rollout. We've really seen that tested as, we've got reports on the ground that the virus there is out of control. We haven't seen that much differentiation in terms of vaccine rollout. But as we move into 2021 and as we kind of get countries moving into that critical mass of vaccination, could become more of a differentiator in terms of currency performance. And probably ZAR is one of the ones that is a lot more vulnerable.
In terms of the euro, just want to ask you about euro dollar then, Emma, because we've talked about the dollar side, maybe not so much the euro side. The euro actually quite substantial moves this morning, down 0.4%. The dollar broadly is stronger, so maybe it is just a dollar story. But what are you watching in particular on the euro at this point?
Yeah, we've really seen a pullback in euro dollar. And I think, it is that very classic story, probably driven by the US 10-year yield. We were always quite skeptical about how much further the euro dollar rally could go. For example, our high was 124, and we think we're really kind of, reaching the end of the euro dollar rally, and we're going to see a reversal in terms of dollar direction. Ours wasn't premised on the belief of a higher US 10-year yield because of increased fiscal stimulus coming from the US. It's more a growth story. We think really the US has the potential to much stronger outperform the Eurozone. I think the Eurozone will really struggle when it comes to growing and showing that, debt burdens can be sustainable in some of those weaker nations, such as Italy. We obviously had, a stronger euro last year because of the EU recovery fund and kind of optimism about fiscal union. But, that's priced in now. So I think, moving into 2021, we've seen a lot of concern in Germany and in France about vaccine rollout and how having a coordinated Eurozone vaccine rollout has actually held back specific nations. So that actually could be another test to the Eurozone.
What do you see the European Central Bank doing, if anything, Amer? I mean, it seems like they're pretty powerless to affect any change.
Yeah, that's completely true. I think the next hurdle, if they want to go for it, is yield curve control, which is something they've been hesitant to do. Obviously, we've seen it, in different economies, such as Australia, because of the pandemic. I think they definitely will have to retain very accommodative monetary policy, but very anemic Eurozone CPI. There's no real impulse about how you're going to get that demand push inflation coming through. I mean, growth was pretty anemic even before COVID. So, we've had a lot of fiscal support in the Eurozone, a lot more than in the US, and there's still not that very strong growth momentum. Really, it's being predominantly powered by Germany, so you're not getting it across the broad Eurozone.
Amer, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time today. Amer Daly there, Macquarie Bank FX strategist. She's going to be continuing the conversation with Anna and myself on Bloomberg Radio at 9 a.m. UK time. So in just about 40 minutes, definitely tune in on London DAB Digital for that. Coming up, we hear from our exclusive interview with the German Finance Minister, Olaf Scholz. I have to give a shout out to my producer, Agatha Cantrill, who got this exclusive interview yesterday. I rushed over then with her to the German Finance Ministry, which is an unbelievably cool building here in the Capitol, and asked him what he thought about the Capitol events at the Capitol in Washington, D.C. That's next. This is Bloomberg.
It was really something that is embarrassing a lot of people to see what happens at the Capitol. My view is that this has a reason. This were the actions of the President Trump that was always not accepting the outcome of the elections. And it is something of a very democratic principle to accept elections. And if you are not successful, you have to agree to the results. And asking people not to accept the election is one of the reasons for all the things we saw yesterday night.
He did refuse and said he'll always refuse to concede the election defeat. Do you think the U.S. president needs to come out and admit his loss?
I'm sure that the president should have admitted his loss for a long time, and now it's the last time to do so.
He's been accused of inciting an insurrection. I think Walter Steinmeier said something to that effect. Are there laws in this country that would stop a leader from inciting such a mob insurrection?
In the end, it is something that should not happen anywhere. It is one of the key principles of democracy that you accept a defeat and that you not ask people to develop violent actions against the parliament and, in this case, the Congress.
But does it disappoint you that such an important democratic partner allows such a thing to happen?
Not happy about the things we saw yesterday, but we are quite confident that things will become better. And you should know that the European Union and the United States are important democracy, and our cooperation and transatlantic partnership is important for democracy in the world. So it is absolutely key that the democratic principles are obeyed in our countries, and I hope this will be better in the United States.
But how has the transatlantic partnership been injured during the Trump presidency?
The main aspect of international relations for us is that we understand that there are a lot of interests of countries and things like that. This is okay. But there are also a lot of things that are important for us together. And the United States and the European countries are democratic states. We have the same principles, and that should have an impact on the way we are cooperating. And in the end, we should be responsible for a multilateral cooperation in the world. This is the only way to get peace in the future.
And that was my exclusive interview with the German finance minister, Olaf Scholz, yesterday here in Berlin. Let's take a look now at some of your movers in early on in the session, 25 minutes in the session. We see Sodexo right now rising almost 6% after boosting its underlying operating profit margin target. Investors like that. They also like Infineon, the German chip maker, up almost 6% as well. U.S. bellwether Micron issued a bullish forecast, and TSMC, the Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing company, also reported record quarterly revenue. So investors see it as in good company. Credit Suisse, on the other hand, is down. The Swiss bank expects a fourth quarter loss as provisions jump for residential mortgage-backed securities. Anna?
Matt, up next on the programme, the food and drink industry is sounding the alarm over post-Brexit tariffs. We'll speak to Dominic Gowdy, head of international trade at the UK Food and Drink Federation. What have they experienced since the start of the year? Do they have a full sense of what the trade deal means for their industry? This is Bloomberg.
Welcome back to Bloomberg Markets. This is the European Open. We are 30 minutes into the trading day right now and looking at gains in European stocks. You can see here the European benchmark stock 600 index up almost 0.75%. And if you take a look at how the index has done in terms of industry groups, you can pull that up with your GRR screen. And right now, I'm looking at travel and leisure stocks doing the best, up 3%. Tech stocks, we showed you Infineon there, up 2.33%. Retail up more than 1% as well. The buy everything rally in equities, though, is really in full swing. No industry groups are down, and a positive mood continuing, hopefully into the weekend. Joining us now is Bloomberg's Danny Berger. So, Danny, how much enthusiasm do you see behind these gains? It's not really a wall of worry at all, is it?
It really isn't. I think, Matt, the fact that you see both cyclicals and the more defensive and tech rallying all at the same time, as you pointed out, looking at the GRR screen, I think that really is a sign that the reflation, the blue wave narrative, it has a really strong hold on the markets at the moment. It's going to be really difficult, at least for the short term, for that to reverse. And look, we see shorts also disappearing from the market. Goldman Sachs's basket of most shorted equities had its biggest day yesterday since the summer. It's now at a record high. That usually is a sign of some short covering, people basically not wanting to put negative bets on those as well. Within this, we've also seen volatility come down from the market. The VIX has been falling. And when the VIX falls, when there's that suppressed volatility, we usually do see fresh cash be put to work in these equity markets.
Right, and so when we see this fresh cash coming through in equity markets, Danny, how much of these gains are coming from more speculative corners of the market, or how much is perceived as more long-term?
We do see a lot of this sort of speculative type of action as a proportion. It's more hard to say, but we did see, for example, call volumes have been extremely high this week. On Wednesday, 30 million call options were traded. That's the fourth highest in history. Also, some more of the sort of speculative assets have also done very well. We, of course, have to talk about Bitcoin when we put it in that perspective, briefly touching $40,000. We also had Bitcoin exchanges even crash because of all the enthusiasm and the people using them. And at the same time, Tesla, another day trader favorite, also surged to new highs as well. And so these are the kind of moves that, yes, they often do trouble market observers because they're ones that happen quickly, therefore could unravel quickly. But for now, a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of action behind these moves higher.
It's benefited Elon Musk for sure. How much has his wealth grown when you follow him on Rich Go?
Yeah, well, his wealth has grown now to surpass that of Jeff Bezos, becoming the richest person in the world. He's had a really meteoric rise through the ranks on Rich Go, and that really is due to the rise of Tesla. He's added $165.5 billion to his net worth in the past year. I mean, that's an incredible number. Bezos himself, though, has lamented the fact that he's cash poor. Most of this really is tied up in equity in his companies. There was an interesting Twitter exchange yesterday when he learned about the news of his new status as #1. He tweeted, "How strange," and then, well, back to work.
Danny, thank you very much. Danny Berger with the latest on the markets and indeed how that is impacting, how that's playing out for Elon Musk. Let's get back to matters Brexit related. The City of London has now spent a week in a new world without access to the EU's single market. Here, or certainly not on the terms that it used to have, here are what some of Bloomberg's top guests had to say about the change.
EU share trading has gone and would not return.
Today, overnight, we've seen 99.6% of that business shift to Europe.
After the end of the Brexit transition, we see over 95% and increasing percentage of our EU share trading has moved from the UK to our EU platform.
I don't think this is really an issue. Yes, there will be some shifting of activities, and there was some shifting of activities to the continent, but it's still relatively minor. So at the end of the day, London's advantages are just too big.
On a global scale, London in a post-Brexit environment still does have very much a big part to play in global financial services.
So that's the financial services story. Meanwhile, the roads to Dover may be eerily quiet as the year gets underway, but trucking companies have been telling Bloomberg that behind the scenes, the situation is a mess, with drivers struggling to adjust to the new paperwork required. Another industry sounding the alarm is the food and drink sector. Joining us now is Dominic Goody, who I'm pleased we can speak to now, UK Food and Drink Federation Head of International Trade. Dominic, good to speak to you. I wonder, now you had a little bit of time to look at the detail of the trade deal that's been struck, and of course this came very late in the day and there was a lot of detail to work through. Do you fully understand all of its impacts, and if you do, what was the nastiest surprise you've discovered?
I think we have a good understanding. Much of it was to be expected. But the big challenge that we're seeing at the moment is around rules of origin. And while we had a good understanding of where they were heading, we didn't see the legal details until the 26th of December. So there are a lot of businesses, both on the UK and the EU sides, that are currently unpacking that and working out what that means for their production and what that means for their ability to trade goods across the border. The initial problem that we've been talking about is a real challenge around moving EU goods into other EU markets via the United Kingdom. And at the moment, that is proving a massive headache that's really impacting on EU manufacturers.
Yeah, so this is really interesting. And on this rules of origin issue, Dominic, so if you have EU product comes to the UK, doesn't get changed, but is stored for a while, then you try and send it back to the EU, it incurs tariffs. And is your sense, from conversations you're having, is your sense that this is an unintended consequence of the Brexit trade deal, or was this fully intended by the EU because they want to see an adjustment in the way that the EU and the UK trade?
I think it was intended in as much as they put in place what they called a best-in-class trade deal, but only put in place standard rules of origin, which in many cases are actually less generous than those they agreed with Canada. The problem, as we have it, is that problem around how late in the day it's been communicated. If businesses had time and had some sort of period of adjustment given to them, they would have been able to take measures and take steps to be able to adjust to this. And so it's really a consequence of the lack of notification that they've been given and the lack of any sort of transition period after they became aware of the new requirements to be able to adapt to those new trade flows.
Are there drinks, are there companies that are just not going to bother now, Dominic? I mean, I think of famous British brands, Nuki Brown, Bulmers Cider. Is there something that we're going to be finding very difficult to get here on the continent?
So it's a mixed picture depending on the company. I think most immediately the challenge is for EU goods reaching the Republic of Ireland, because so many businesses treat the UK and the Republic of Ireland as a single market. So the lorries come through to the UK, they drop off for UK customers, and then those goods move on to the Republic. And the challenge is that those flows are not currently set up to be able to make that onward journey. So what we're seeing with companies most immediately are cancelled deliveries into the Republic of Ireland. And talking to one company this week, I heard that means 25 to 30 lorry loads a week of products of a globally famous branded producer won't be reaching those customers. In another case, a business is trying to make sure those goods get through, and they're facing bills of something around £2 million a week to be able to make those deliveries.
What about the other way around? I mean, when pubs open back up, are they going to be able to find enough Guinness to stock?
I would expect so. I mean, I don't represent the alcoholic drinks industry, but I think if alcoholic drinks are made in the EU, they should be able to meet the rules of origin requirements to supply pubs. So you shouldn't have a worry in that case.
You can see where some people's heads are at in this story. Dominic, let me ask you about something we've heard from the UK government, which I really wanted to get your take on. The government has made the point. We've heard this from the Prime Minister himself. We've also heard it from Michael Gove. They've made the point that the extra regulations that are now in place, or the extra paperwork that is now required to do business with the EU, makes businesses more match fit to do business with other parts of the world, which seems an interesting thought process, I suppose. Do you have any sense that doing bureaucracy in one place prepares you for bureaucracy elsewhere?
Well, these are challenges that business will face trading anywhere in the world, and where businesses currently only trade within the UK and with the EU, they have no experience of it. So they're facing a very, very sharp learning curve to be ready. But I think I would agree that that is something in the longer term, that once you get used to being able to trade with the EU, it is a lesson that can be applied to trading elsewhere in the world and overcoming very similar hurdles and barriers to trades to be able to do that. But I think in the short term, it's really trying to make sure that you can keep trading into those near markets where a lot of businesses have a lot of trade that they're trying to maintain.
When do you think, what kind of percentage of normal traffic are we seeing at the moment? Have your members managed to avoid having to transport very much over this first week during this testing time? And also because of COVID restrictions, of course, the general public not on the road so much. I wonder when you think we'll see the full test of whether the industry has adapted to these new rules.
So everything I've heard is that there's been a massive reduction in flows of goods. Many of our members have stopped trading for the first couple of weeks of the year, and that was intentional. They stockpiled goods both here and on the continent, both finished goods, raw materials, packaging and the like. And they gave themselves a window just to make any final adjustments that they needed to make that could be done in that period of time. So in some cases, I'm seeing that businesses will start that trade again next week. Some of them have started during the latter half of this week. But some businesses have carried on throughout that period. But really, I think we're looking at next week and probably the week that follows to see the flows of goods, particularly across the short straits at Dover, returning to the sorts of volumes that we would typically see. And it's at that point, really, that we will get a greater sense of how challenging things may or may not look in terms of the checks at border that happen for many food and drink products when they arrive in the EU, and any possible knock-on effects that that has for deliveries and for the just-in-time supply chains that you mentioned earlier.
Dominic, thanks so much for joining us to talk about this important issue. Dominic Goody, their UK Food and Drink Federation head of international trade, not responsible for alcoholic beverages. But when you talk about the Republic of Ireland, I think about Guinness, and I think that's pretty fair. Coming up, Trump promises a smooth transition of power, but still insists he did not lose the election. We'll speak with Elizabeth Braw, visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Markets. This is the European Open, 46 minutes into the trading day, and we're looking at green arrows across the screen here in terms of equity indexes. Of course, we had the U.S. indexes rally to new highs yesterday, Asian markets rise, and now you can see the DAX up more than 1%. Now, speaking of the U.S., President Trump has promised a smooth transition of power after admitting that Joe Biden will take office on January 20th, though he still insists that he did not lose the election. His comments come after his supporters stormed the U.S. Capitals. He sent them there, overwhelming police barricades and breaking into the building. 5 people, including a police officer, died during the ensuing riot. Joining us now is Elizabeth Braw, American Enterprise Institute visiting fellow. And, you know, I was thinking, Elizabeth, I can't recall any other examples of world leaders sending an angry mob of supporters to attack their own capital. Has this happened before?
It has happened in small countries in what we might call emerging democracies, but nothing in a mature democracy like this, and certainly not in a large mature democracy. And actually, it was interesting yesterday. People from the Middle East and various African countries were saying, "Well, don't compare this to our countries. We don't do this sort of thing. Speak for yourselves." And so it's really a historic event for all the wrong reasons.
Good morning to you, Elizabeth. I wonder where you think this progresses from here. There have been calls, of course, to remove President Trump from office, but he only has 12, 13 days of office remaining. So I wonder what your expectations are on that front.
I think we'll see rapid action, and yes, it's only 12 days, but until then, he has the nuclear button. He has all the power that the U.S. president possesses, and so he has a lot he can do if he decides he wants to take revenge on the country or on the world. And he's a thin-skinned man, as we have seen. So there is enormous concern that he will use that power to take revenge, and that's why we are seeing now congressional Democrats and even some congressional Republicans calling on Mike Pence, the vice president, to invoke the 25th Amendment, by which the cabinet would essentially sack the president and take power. And they say if he doesn't do that, they will impeach the president, which is a congressional function. So we will see a lot lot of action in the next 12 days.
I noticed that, I think it was last weekend, Elizabeth, all of the living former defense secretaries wrote an op-ed for Washington Post. I saw it in Foreign Relations. In any case, warning that the president might use I believe an 1807 Insurrection Act in order to use the military. Is that really a concern?
Anything is possible with this president. He has done crazy things before. For example, something that seems really minor now, but was major at the time. He pulled out U.S. forces from Syria and left the U.S. allies that had been fighting with the U.S., left them completely stranded. And he did that on no basis whatsoever, other than trying to placate his friend Erdogan in Turkey. So things like these really make no sense on the basis of logic. And for that reason, I think something like what you just mentioned is a concern. And that op-ed was really quite remarkable. Donald Rumsfeld and Jim Mattis, William Cohen, they may not agree on anything else, but they agreed that the U.S. military is in danger if this man remains in office.
Elizabeth, thanks so much for joining us. Elizabeth Braw there, American Enterprise Institute visiting fellow, talking to us about the extraordinary, unprecedented events that we saw on Wednesday at the Capitol. Coming up, how would the Fed tapering, how would that early affect assets? Would we see a taper tantrum is essentially the question that we'll put to MLive's Christine Aquino next. This is Bloomberg.
Welcome back to the European Market Open. 53 minutes into the European trading session for this Friday morning, and we make gains of 0.6% on the Stocks 600. Let's get to Christine Aquino, who leads our Markets Live team here in Europe. Christine, good morning. I wonder if how long we will continue to price in the same narrative. So the narrative we've been running with for a few days now has all been about the blue wave and fiscal stimulus in the United States. That has further to run from here, does it?
Absolutely, Anna, but I think now we're getting to levels where investors might be wanting to take a pause, because this has been a narrative that we've priced in long before we actually got a definitive result on the U.S. election and a definitive result in the makeup of Congress. And so now that it's kind of finally done, there are risks that we're going to see a bit of a consolidation slash sell the fact sort of move going from here. And of course, all the questions are surrounding about the trajectory of Treasury yields now that they've breached that key 1% level. Where does it go from here? And at what point will we see either an extension of that move or a pullback given the expected rotation moves from stocks and other asset classes?
If it does go higher, and we've spoken with a lot of investors who believe it'll hit 150 or 2, and if inflation rears its, I guess, ugly head, although it's a head a lot of people want to see, what happens at the Fed? Do they go into neutral in 2021? Do they need to take even more action? And will we see, your MLive question of the day, essentially a taper tantrum?
Yeah, Matt, I think it's a very valid question. The key difference between now and our last bout of taper tantrum is the fact that the Fed, the ECB, and BOJ, the world's biggest central banks, have a combined $22 trillion balance sheet. And this is something that they have deployed, and they've indicated that they will remain supportive of the recovery and therefore supportive of risk asset sentiment. Despite the fact that we are expecting a move higher in inflation. And I really think that is the key difference between now and then, is the fact that we do still have this commitment from central banks to stay supportive. And so that will do a big job of limiting the rise in yields that we are anticipating on the back of this. I think the bigger question to be asking, and it's something that will play out longer term then, is it really just underlines the question of where will the havens be then if we are seeing a bit of a move in bond markets, yields moving higher. Yeah, and then that's a longer term question.
Okay. It is, Christine, one we will return to, no doubt. Thank you so much, Christine Aquino, who leads our Markets Live team in Europe. That is it for the European Market Open. Matt and I are off to radio. Surveillance is next. This is Bloomberg.
Democratic leaders call for President Trump to be removed from office for inciting the Capitol chaos. The clock ticks. There are 12 days left in his administration. Donald Trump finally concedes that Joe Biden will be the next president. Meanwhile, there's reports that the president is considering pardoning himself, as well as a sweeping list of other individuals. And global stocks continue to climb after U.S. equities close at an all-time high. Traders bet on additional stimulus, and it's also Jobs Day. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, a bit quieter, certainly, when it comes to political news around the world. The focus is firmly on the markets. The focus is also now on stimulus. As we continue following Washington very closely, Trump finally conceding to Joe Biden and saying that he will take office. Now, stocks are rising in general in Europe. U.S. futures also up. Investors, again, continuing to look past turmoil in Washington towards a prospect of a Biden presidency and a Democrat-controlled Congress. The dollar gaining, Bitcoin dropping after topping $40,000, and crude oil actually edging higher. Now let's get straight to the Bloomberg First Word News. Here's Leanne Gerrans. Hi, Leanne.
Good morning, Francine. There are mounting calls for President Trump to resign or be removed from office after the violence on Capitol Hill. Top Democrats are calling on Vice President Mike Pence to act, saying otherwise they may start the impeachment process. It comes amid a wave of resignations in the U.S. government over the president's incitement of the mob. Now, President-elect Joe Biden has described the Trump supporters that stormed the U.S. Capitol as domestic terrorists, adding they would have been treated much more harshly if they had represented Black Lives Matter. The incoming president attacked his predecessor for creating an atmosphere that allowed the violence to happen. Bloomberg sources tell us President Trump has prepared a list of individuals he's hoping to pardon in the final days of his presidency. It includes senior White House officials, family members, prominent rappers, and maybe the president himself. Bloomberg is told he's hoping to announce the pardons on January the 19th. That's his last full day in office. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Leanne Gerrans. This is Bloomberg. Francine.
Thank you so much, Leanne. Now, joining us this morning is Brett Bruen. He's president of the Global Situation Room. Brett was director of global engagement at the White House under President Obama. He joins us now from the D.C. area to talk about the week that was. Brett, should the focus now be on Joe Biden, or do we need still to try and understand what happens to President Trump in the next 12 days?
Well, I think there is a remaining focus on President Trump and what transpired earlier this week up on Capitol Hill. But the process is going to be a long one, and I think the aspirations of some Democrats and even a few Republicans to remove President Trump from office in the 12 days that still remain before Joe Biden is inaugurated are unrealistic. That being said, I don't think that Donald Trump's legal troubles will be over when he leaves office.
Brett, what is the number one thing that actually Joe Biden should focus on right now? How does he bring the country together after the week that we've seen?
I think he has got to find a way to compromise. And obviously there are going to be a lot of efforts within the Democratic Party to try and stake out ideological ground. I think what Joe Biden needs to do is to stake out ground centered around American ideals and to bring the country back to those common set of core values. And to do that, I think it's important for the Bloomberg audience to understand, and we've seen examples just in the last couple of days, of the role the companies can play in helping to promote reconciliation, reminding Americans that we have more in common that divides us.
Brett, something that I'm trying to figure out, and we're trying to figure out, certainly from London, is did the events and the rioting on Capitol Hill actually unite Americans, or did it further divide them?
I think in certain respects we have seen, and it was witnessed in the early hours of the morning after the Capitol was invaded, that you have seen a number of Republicans that are separating themselves from Trump and Trumpism. They realize this has gone too far. I have to also say that the election on Tuesday in Georgia was a pretty stark reminder for Republicans that Trump is not able to carry them over, even in reliably Republican states like Georgia, in a runoff election that they should have won. So Republicans are having second thoughts about Trump's ambition to stay relevant, to stay in control of the party for the next 4 years.
When do we know what the fate of Donald Trump from now is? What about the Republican voter? Do they actually believe this was a legitimate election, and would they vote for Trump again, even if he were to have an independent party?
I think we're going to have to wait a couple weeks to see in polls and in some of the positions that Republican leaders stake out. Just this morning, we saw yet another cabinet secretary, Betsy DeVos, Secretary of Education, resign. So all of this is likely to have an impact. And by the time that we get to January 20th and on into February, the true extent of the damage of what Donald Trump has brought to the Republican Party, I think, will be more evident. But this is going to take months to really have its full effect. And I have to say, for Republicans, looking ahead just to legislative elections in now less than 2 years, there's going to have to be some quick repair to try to restore confidence, especially amongst those suburban voters that they lost in November.
Brett, what will the Democratic administration of Joe Biden actually look like? So is it going to be moderate? Is it going to be a little bit more left-wing? Again, what kind of tone do they have to strike in the first 20 days?
Biden, just in the announcements of cabinet secretaries and other senior positions that he has unveiled thus far, has staked out pretty centrist ground and has resisted a lot of the pressure from progressives on the left to include those that have a more ideological agenda. And I think Biden understands that in order to both govern, but more importantly, in order to heal the wounds of our country, he is going to have to reach across the aisle. This is something that Joe Biden is uniquely capable of doing. He has spent decades in the Senate. He has good relations with Mitch McConnell, who will soon be the minority leader in the Senate, as well as other Republicans. That will be critical.
Thank you so much, Brett Bruen there, president of the Global Situation Room, joining us from D.C. Now, in the meantime, we're also getting some breaking news on vaccines here in Europe. A lot of officials coming under fire for a symbolic way of putting them out. Mrs. van der Leyen of the European Commission, where she's president, said Europe will have more than needed vaccine. They'll have an additional 300 million Pfizer vaccine doses. So we'll need to really look at the numbers to see whether that's enough. Of course, it's also a way of how you distribute it, on who has access first. We saw, if you look at the country, we don't talk about races, but if you actually rank them, France, for the moment, still being behind. We'll talk a lot more about vaccine distribution in Europe. Coming up on Bloomberg Surveillance, we speak to the former Swedish Prime Minister Carl Bildt about the events we've seen in Washington this week. This is Bloomberg.
is critically important that the markets stay open in this time, as opposed to trying to take breaks in the middle. I think that that'll just push off the situation a little bit, but actually could create other pent-up issues if you do close the markets.
Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now let's get back to our top story. In a day after he urged his angry supporters to take action, President Trump condemned the storming of the U.S. Capitol. In a video released last night, the president accused the mob of defiling the seat of the U.S. democracy. He also said he would now turn his focus to ensuring a smooth, orderly, and seamless transition of power. Well, joining us now is Eric Nielsen. He's Group Chief Economist at UniCredit. Eric, away from the political talk that's really been engaging us, and with resignations also at the White House, does this have implication for Joe Biden's policies going forward?
I think the bigger story here is that the Democrats won in Georgia. So the Democrats have now a control of all three levels of power. And that means that we can go back and see what Joe Biden promised on fiscal policy. And that is now overwhelmingly likely to be implemented over the next year or thereabout. That includes higher taxation of corporates, for example, but also a big fiscal stimulus package to the less well-off in society. So this has suddenly got a lot more momentum than it had before.
Eric, what does that mean for actually how much? I mean, there's a majority, it's a thin majority. What does that mean for what you think the Democrats will be able to push through? Is it stimulus? Is it infrastructure spending? What happens to taxes?
Yeah, I think that's right. It is thin. So there's a limit to what they can do. And I think, as you said in the previous segment for the gentleman from Washington, that Joe Biden is a man who has always dealt well with Congress. He knows them. So my suspicion would be that he would like to have some Republicans along in what he does with the bigger programs, including infrastructure projects and thereabout. But he can't get away with not implementing some of the things that he has said about the corporate sector, for example, higher taxation. And the big fiscal stimulus package will come for sure now. And it will be a bit more like what the Democrats wanted, which is probably not the $2,000 blank check across everybody. And it wouldn't make sense anyway, but more targeted to those who are suffering most during this pandemic.
So when you look at the markets, Eric, there's a clear reflationary trade. Are we going to see the start of inflationary pressures coming from the U.S.?
Now, that's going to be further down the line. I was just looking through again. We just look at the numbers. I mean, there will be an output gap in the U.S. for at least another year, 2 years or thereabout. So I don't see any underlying inflation pressure. But I mean, the long end of the curve is going to move a little bit higher, as you talked about also in the previous section. And there is an underlying movement because the Fed seems to be a little bit on hold here. I mean, what they said in December surprised me, that they didn't commit more. And I don't think they're going to change that tone short term. So you will see a little bit of a steepening of the curve, but an underlying inflation story, I don't see it for another couple of years at least.
Eric, when you're expecting all of this, Democratic spending, or for the Democrats to try and push through things, does it start straight away, or do they need first to try and put the country together, less division after the week that we've had in politics?
Oh my God, I know. I wish I knew. I mean, these two things hang together, right? I mean, there's no question that, excuse me, there's no question that Joe Biden has to do something immediately. I'm not the one to explain or understand fully to what extent and what it takes to unite the U.S. again. I mean, it sounds from my vantage point horrible, but it is. But hopefully he can do some of that. But he can do it at the same time as he does fiscal policies. And in many ways, this hangs together, right? He needs to look after those who have not been looked after well enough in during these years, and particularly the last year, those who suffered most from the pandemic. And I think that's part of his program, as far as I understand.
Eric, what kind of economy do you think the U.S. will be in 12 months? I know, we talk about the U.S. and China. I don't know whether what we saw on Capitol Hill and the rioting gives China an opportunity to actually have a leg up towards the U.S. But how do you expect that trade relationship to go, and what does that mean for the economy?
I think, so this is probably a decade-long discussion to have about the U.S.-China relations. My understanding is that Joe Biden wanted to sort of try to normalize, turn down the volume a little bit on the discussions with China. But again, I mean, look, as far as I can see, it was not Trump who ultimately changed the relationship between the U.S. and China. That has been going on earlier. Remember, it was Obama who had the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement precisely designed to isolate China and push them closer along to a more fair way of trading and investing. So this has been going on for a long time. Trump just brought out the megaphone. And I think we are moving towards a more regional kind of trade pattern. It was also Obama who had not gone after the WTO sufficiently and appointed people. So Trump made it worse. But this is not only Trump, right? This is a massive, massive story for decades to come. Henry Kissinger wrote about it all his life, in a sense, right? So I think we have to sort of sit back and see how that works. I'm still worried about China also from a point of view of what you've seen lately in terms of their interaction with the WHO, refusing to cooperate, as I understand it, on the virus investigations. And then there's the crackdown on people in Hong Kong and how they handle some of the corporates. I think there's a lot of thinking in Europe and America about where that's going to go, and I don't have the answer for sure.
Eric, thank you so much. We'll have plenty more from Eric Nielsen there from UniCredit. Now, coming up, the world continues to lock down as cases surge, but the Pfizer vaccine could offer hope against a new fast-spreading variant. We have the details of what kind of recovery. We'll also talk about vaccine distribution in Europe. That's coming up next, and this is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Francine Lacquet here in London. Now let's talk about the virus and vaccines. The European Union has secured an additional 300 million doses of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. Now that's according to European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. She's speaking right now. Now the news comes as a study found that the Pfizer vaccine may also work against the highly transmissible virus variants discovered in the UK and South Africa. Now to talk about the recovery and to talk about what we can expect in 2021 and beyond is Eric Nielsen from UniCredit. Eric, first of all, I reread all of your yearly note, actually looking through all of the markets. I know it's very comprehensive, and it's a great piece of work. You talk about China, you talk about the S&P and things like that. Where do you think we'll see the biggest shocks economically if you look at regions?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, shocks are very difficult to forecast, right? I mean, so I think what the big question marks are rather phrased it is, how fast does the vaccine come out, and how do people react to the vaccine? How safe do they feel again? Remember, both in America and in Europe, we have enormously high savings ratios in the household sector. If that money suddenly gets employed, we will get a very nice upswing in the second half of the year. And then, of course, that relates to the whole issue of the policy response and the market, how the markets react. If central banks start to slow down, or, God forbid, in Europe, with the fiscal rules, people talk about withdrawing the fiscal stimulus too early. So I think for me, those are the big question marks and where shocks, mini shocks, could come from.
Eric, what do you do with Europe right now? So, I don't know whether you look at just the rollout of the vaccine to try and understand whether this economic region will get back on its feet maybe quicker than some are predicting right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think the immediate the feeling one has right now is disappointment, right? We get lots of statements about how much they can buy and all the rest of it, but Europe has not done well so far in terms of getting people vaccinated. The UK is doing much better, let alone Israel, and the US is doing, it seems, a better job right now. With the healthcare system, I don't understand. Take a place like France, which has first-class healthcare, and then they can only vaccinate a few thousand people. I don't understand. And I'm not an expert in this, but I'm stunned by the numbers, how slow this comes. But hopefully it accelerates. Otherwise, the whole European coordination in that area will end up looking a bit poor, to put it politely.
Eric, we also have, we need to spend a bit of time, I guess, talking about Italy, not political stability, which is also in question, but just right. The recovery fund. If you look at some of the countries that, have been hit most by COVID-19, how much time this year do you give them to try and figure out what they do with that money and whether it's, put to good use or squandered?
Yeah, so, this is a big question, right? That's I think you want to keep thinking about it in two terms. There's the immediate impact money that sort of cushions the most vulnerable in society and those who've been hit by the pandemic and who try to sort of, as a cyclical stimulus. That money really is national money. And that's why I said one must not withdraw the fiscal too early. Then there is the European money, which is much more strategic money in terms of climate change investment and digitalization and bigger common issues. If you think about what was written in the Next Generation EU as you could call it fiscal policy, financing common objectives, particularly those two areas, those will have longer impact. So our estimate is that for Europe as a whole, the Next Generation EU will have only about 0.2 or thereabout positive effect on GDP this year, but then increasing to about 0.5% each of the following 3-4 years or thereabout as the money really gets rolled out. But investment projects always take a while, and that's just reality. I think the Commission is too optimistic in terms of the impact already this year, but that doesn't mean that it's not a good program.
Eric, thanks so much. Eric Nielsen there, Group Chief Economist at UniCredit. Now, we'll have plenty more, of course, on what Eric was talking about, on whether the Commission is too optimistic or some of the concerns after Brexit happen. Of course, we're January 8th now. Coming up, the unexpected flipping of Georgia in the Senate race also paves the way for Joe Biden to implement his plans to reshape the U.S. economy. We'll talk about taxes. We'll also talk about technology giants. We discuss those details next. This is Bloomberg. another day of risk off across the financial markets. We bring you special coverage of all the price action and implications here on Bloomberg Television.
I was actually poor.
No foreplay?
Eat your bag of Lay's with a smile on your face.
If all the diseases have been taken, I'll take a tax.
Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now let's get straight to the Bloomberg First Word News. Here's Leanne Gerrans. Hi, Leanne.
Hi, Francine. There are mounting calls for President Trump to resign or be removed from office after the violence on Capitol Hill. Top Democrats are calling on Vice President Mike Pence to act, saying otherwise they may start the impeachment process. It comes amid a wave of resignations in the U.S. government over the president's incitement of the mob. Now, Germany's Health Minister Jens Spahn is considering running for Chancellor. That is according to local media reports. Over in Germany, the 40-year-old has long been seen as a rising star in the ruling Conservative bloc. One poll last month showed he had moved ahead of Chancellor Angela Merkel as the nation's most popular politician. Merkel plans to leave the post after elections in September. Now, the UK is imposing mandatory COVID tests on all passengers arriving in the country. Anyone failing to do so will face an immediate fine of £500. Travellers arriving from countries not approved on the list have to isolate at home for 10 days, regardless of the test results. The UK is aiming to vaccinate at least 200,000 people a day by January the 15th. And the US is suspending plans for tariffs on $1.3 billion of French goods. The move was in retaliation for the country's tax on the revenue of global tech companies, many of them American firms. The decision not to go ahead de-escalates a transatlantic trade dispute just 2 weeks before President Trump does leave office. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Leanne Gerrans. This is Bloomberg. Francine.
Leanne, thank you so much. Now, with Democrats set to gain control of the U.S. Senate and House, President-elect Joe Biden will have a clean slate to reshape the economy, starting with COVID relief funds. Yesterday, we spoke exclusively to the Cleveland Fed President, Loretta Mester. She said she didn't believe ramped-up fiscal stimulus under Biden would pave the way for a Fed pullback on monetary policy this year.
I don't really see it impacting the need for monetary policy to be there to support the recovery, because I don't think we're going to be necessarily back to our goals in short set. I think this is a real journey, not a sprint.
Well, joining us now is Scott Thiel, Chief Fixed Income Strategist at BlackRock Investment Institute. Scott, as always, thank you so much for joining us. When you look at the week that was, certainly on Capitol Hill with the rioting, does it have an impact on fixed income?
Well, I mean, I think obviously the most important thing is obviously what's happened in terms of the political events and the impact it's had not only on the political system but on people's lives, right? I think it's obviously important to reflect that 4 people have lost their lives in the process of this events on Capitol Hill, in addition to everything else. But in terms of fixed income, no, Francine, I mean, I think what we just heard from the Fed there and what they've been echoing is that, in this environment, both monetary policy and fiscal policy are going to continue to be very supportive of the economy and of the markets going forward. And I think, when asked why isn't the market, particularly fixed income, reacted in a kind of risk-off way to the events that transpired over the last few days, I mean, a big answer to that is obviously the support, both fiscal and monetary. I would note, though, that the blue wave or the blue tide, or whatever we want to call the change in the Senate over the course of the last few days has obviously impacted fixed income relatively significantly, right? Particularly when we look at yields and break-evens or implied inflation rates in the U.S. in particular, right? We've had break-evens move, Francine, from before the election at 175, so expected inflation over 10 years at 1 3/4, to now more than 2%, 2.1 this morning. Really big move. But at the same time, nominal yields have also moved higher. And I think this is the important part about where the Fed comes in terms of, are yields now moving too aggressively higher? Are they too high overall? We're through 1% in the 10-year Treasury. So I think it'll be really interesting to see, in some respects, because of the blue wave, because of the continued support, because of the vaccination news, which is obviously positive, coupled with obviously here in Europe, as you just discussed, there's been some negative developments, some significant negative developments. But it's going to be interesting to see how monetary policy responds to this increase in yields, which is, again, I think part of the move wider in break-evens.
Scott, what exactly happens to the 10-year, Treasury yield from now? So how much of a reflationary trade will continue with a Democratic Senate and Joe Biden at the White House?
Well, I think there's an important element to the difference in where we sit today than where we sat, before Epiphany, before January 6th, before the runoff, was that now, the pathway for more fiscal spending is clearer. Right now, how much we get, we'll see. And obviously, there is this idea that we do have very, very narrow margins. Obviously, the narrowest you can in the Senate and narrow in the Congress as well, to see what kind of fiscal push can get made. But I do think that yields and the yield curve are reacting to that. But again, as I said before, I think the Fed really is key on keeping financial conditions easy. And so we don't expect a very big move higher in yields here, as monetary policy is going to stay on hold. One of our key themes and a big important view around our positive view on risk assets is this idea of new nominal, right, Francine, which is where rates stay relatively stable. And although inflation increases, it doesn't solicit a policy response from the Fed. And that's positive for risk assets, and obviously for treasuries means very range bound.
So, Scott, what would actually, warrant a policy response?
Well, I think obviously to the extent that that we got, very positive rebound in economic activity, or if the vaccination or the virus impact would be significantly less than expected. But I think we're far from there, right? In particular, the employment situation with the new Fed framework. We're not at the point where we should be talking about withdrawing both fiscal or monetary policy.
When you look, Scott, at some of the data points that we're getting, so we're getting jobs today, does that just come second to everything else that we were just talking about, especially until we exactly figure out what the Democrats can do in Congress?
Yeah, I think this is a very important point. I think that the incoming data has been so, contorted by what's happening in terms of the virus, in terms of the economic lockdown. I think investors are looking through the near-term economic data to try and assess how significant the overall economic impact of the lockdowns is going to be with the vaccination news, and now with the Democratic control of all three houses of the U.S. government. So I think that the near-term economic news takes a back seat, right? Because investors are trying to assess what is the total damage to the economy from this entire situation, and how will the markets react to that total damage? What is we talk about the economic scarring. How much economic scarring will there be as a result of all of this? And I think that's what the markets are really focused on, right? That's why equities keep rallying, because they're looking through what is obviously going to be poor economic news, particularly here in Europe, right? With obviously this new wave of lockdowns, economic growth forecasts are being pushed lower to where we get back to trend is being pushed farther away. But, markets look through that because they look at the total economic impact and the potential for scarring, and they still don't, they still see a positive view at the, positive light at the end of the tunnel.
Scott, what's the biggest challenge for the ECB this year?
Well, again, I think that the ECB has to balance both the kind of the virus dynamics plus the inflation dynamics that are part of their ongoing struggle. Obviously, I think that the ECB will continue, like the Fed, to push, to push forward and try and both provide the support that the economy needs during this crisis. But obviously, the Fed went through a major review of their policies, and the ECB is doing the same. And so it will be interesting to see what comes out of that. And I think for ECB watchers, that's obviously going to be a very significant development, and we'll wait for the news for that as that rolls out. But again, I think, for them, it's about, the EU Recovery Fund is in place, their policies are in place. And we'll see, particularly with the developments in the virus in Germany and here in the UK, obviously not for the ECB in the UK, but for Germany, how that is going to impact economic development.
Scott, thank you so much. Scott Thiel there, Chief Fixed Income Strategist at BlackRock Investment Institute. Always some great insights. Now, stay with surveillance, plenty coming up, but including, the European response to the chaos in Washington with Carl Bildt, the former Swedish Prime Minister and co-chair of the European Council on Foreign Relations. That's coming up shortly, and this is Bloomberg.
It was really something that is embarrassing a lot of people to see what happens at the Capitol. My view is that this has a reason. This were the actions of the President Trump that was always not accepting the outcome of the elections. And it is something of a very democratic principle to accept elections. And if you are not successful, you have to agree to the results. And asking people not to accept the election is one of the reasons for all the things we saw yesterday night.
He did refuse and said he'll always refuse to concede the election defeat. Do you think the U.S. president needs to come out and admit his loss?
I'm sure that the president should have admitted his loss for a long time, and now it's the last time to do so.
He was, he's been accused of inciting an insurrection. I think Walter Steinmeier said something to that effect. Are there laws in this country that would stop a leader from inciting such a mob insurrection?
In the end, it is something that should not happen anywhere. It is one of the key principles of democracy that you accept a defeat and that you not ask people to develop violent actions against the parliament and in this this case the Congress.
So, but does it disappoint you that such an important Democratic partner allows such a thing to happen?
Not happy about the things we saw yesterday, but we are quite confident that things will become better. And you should know that the European Union and the United States are important democracy, and our cooperation and transatlantic partnership is important for democracy in the world. So it is absolutely key that the democratic principles are obeyed in our countries, and I hope this will be better in the United States.
But how has the transatlantic partnership been injured during the Trump presidency?
The main aspect of international relations for us is that we understand that there are a lot of interests of countries and things like that. This is okay, but there are also a lot of things that are important for us together. And the United States and the European countries are democratic states. We have the same principles, and that should have an impact on the way we are cooperating. And in the end, we should be responsible for a multilateral cooperation in the world. This is the only way to get peace in the future.
Our exclusive interview with the German Finance Minister Olaf Scholz. Now, he told also Matt Miller that the chaos seen at the Capitol on Wednesday is a demonstration of President Trump not accepting the outcome of the election. Now, let's get more reaction, European reaction, of course, on all of this. Joining us from Stockholm is Carl Bildt. He's a former Swedish Prime Minister and co-chair of the European Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Bildt, thank you so much, as always, for giving Bloomberg a bit of your time. When you look at the week that was in U.S. politics, and of course, we also remember the people that gave their life to what happened on Wednesday on Capitol Hill, how should Europe react?
Well, I think Europe has spoken up in support of sort of the long-standing ties with the United States, in spite of everything, in support of democracy in the United States and elsewhere, and make clear both its shock, horror over what we saw on that very, very dark day for the United States on Wednesday, but also its confidence in the ultimate triumph of the institutions of the American Constitution, which have gone through perhaps its greatest challenge since the Civil War, with a president that has gone from leader of the world's greatest democracy to a threat against that very democracy. So it's been both the darkness of the horrors and the appalling acts that we saw on Wednesday, and the ultimate faith in the institutions of American democracy.
Is this the end of American exceptionalism? And if it is, what does a new world order look like in foreign policy?
Well, the world has changed irrespective of this. We have sort of a rebalancing of the power relationship in the world. It is not as dominated by the United States as it used to be. We all know that. And of course, what has happened on Wednesday has made it somewhat more difficult for the United States to lecture other countries of democracy and other things. I don't think that affects the relationship with Europe that much, but there could be other parts, Latin America, Asia, Africa, where the word of America, United States, when it comes to democracy and freedom, will not have the force, the credibility, the strength that we have been relying on for a long time.
Carl Bildt, when you look at the way that China should look at this, or the way they have looked at this, is there even more of a power vacuum for them to take space?
I think there's an element of glee from the Chinese side and from the Americans. I mean, they are saying, well, look at our stability, and you see this bloody chaos, where they can't even keep control of their Congress, and where they storm and they don't accept elections, and it's a bloody mess. That's been the reaction again from the Chinese, not officially, but you can see that in media, most probably from others. I mean, most probably that's been the reaction that's coming informally out of the Kremlin as well. Does that affect power? To some extent it does, because the United States is dependent upon, of course, its hard power, be that the military power or that the strength of the dollar or whatever. But the United States is ultimately even more depending on its soft power, the credibility, the attractiveness of the American model of government and society. And that has taken a beating. There is unfortunately no avoiding that conclusion.
Does it mean, Carl Bildt, that actually China will fill that vacuum, or is there more space for Europe to be the beacon of democracy?
Well, I wouldn't call it a vacuum. That's to carry it too far. But I mean, there's a shift, and the Chinese will clearly do whatever they can in order to use the possibilities that are there. I think they are very, very careful now, awaiting the incoming Biden administration and are focusing all of their attention on that. For Europe, absolutely. I think there will be soul searching. There already is. The question is, a lot of focus, as a matter of fact, less on January 20th than on 2024. Are we seeing now a period in American history where Trump is parenthesis, or will Joe Biden be the parenthesis? We'll see the answer to that in 4 years' time.
What will make the difference, Mr. Bildt? Is there something that Joe Biden should do now to be sure that he is not the parenthesis?
Well, he must succeed. That's easy to say on this side of the Atlantic. I mean, he's taking over power in a very difficult situation. I mean, the entire COVID crisis is going to be with us for quite some time. I mean, it's accelerating in the United States. It's accelerating in Europe. We have a global challenge that needs to be met when it comes to COVID and vaccines. And then, of course, he has an economic challenge. He has the polarization of the American political spectrum. So it's quite a challenging time. Much depends on, there's midterm elections in 22, there's a presidential election in 24. If he were to, or his administration, the one way or the other, if they are around for 2 periods, then I think we can say that we are out of the Trump nightmare. But if that is not the case, well, then we'll see.
Carl Bildt, Europe is also going through a challenging time in trying to keep, of course, COVID-19 under control, but also distribution of the vaccines. Do you worry that if there's not more stimulus, or do you worry that if we go into austerity, or do you worry that if we don't distribute this vaccine properly, then what will come after these current leaders will be, even more divisive than what we've seen in the past?
Not that much at the moment. I think vaccine is probably going to come out somewhat slower than people would hope for, particularly since we hope that it will be completed by next week, and that's not going to be the case. But let's see where we are in the summer. Then we are going to go through a transition in Germany with Angela Merkel handing over to someone in October. But Germany is essentially a country with a lot of stability, so that doesn't worry me that much. I think the big challenge is going to be what I call the recovery from the recovery in Europe. When we have to exit at some point in time, all of the things that we are doing now, massive subsidies, massive debt, we have no restrictions on state subsidies. We have sort of abandoned the competition rules for the time being. But at some point in time, a year from now or something like that, we need to go back to basics in economic policy, and that will be somewhat challenging.
Carl Bildt, thank you so much for joining us today, the co-chair, of course, of the European Council on Foreign Relations there. Now, coming up, Simon & Schuster scraps plans to publish a book by Senator Josh Hawley over his connection to the riots on Capitol Hill. We'll bring you more details next, and this is Bloomberg.
climate change is the defining issue of our time. So we've redefined how we cover it. With clear data and rigorous journalism, we rise to the scale of the challenge to reveal the breadth of possibility. We look at stories from every angle to provoke debate, spotlight solutions, and make sense of the greatest crisis of our generation. Bloomberg Green, solutions for a changing climate.
It is critically important that the markets stay open in this time, as opposed to trying to take breaks in the middle. I think that that'll just push off the situation a little bit, but actually could create other pent-up issues if you do close the markets.
Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now let's get straight to the Bloomberg Business Flash. Here's Leanne Gerrans. Hi, Leanne.
Hi, Francine. Simon & Schuster has cancelled plans to publish a book by Republican Senator Josh Hawley. The company cited his connection to the effort to overturn the election of Joe Biden that did turn violent on Wednesday. Hawley calls the move a direct assault of the First Amendment, and he plans to go to court. Elon Musk is now the richest person in the world. He's overtaken Amazon founder Jeff Bezos, who has held the top spot since 2017. Musk is now worth nearly $195 billion. He has added over $165 billion of that in the last year. It's due to a massive surge of shares for his car maker Tesla, which has gained over 23,000% since its IPO back in 2010. And Blackstone is working with Bill Gates on a potential buyout of Signature Aviation. The Microsoft billionaire is the biggest shareholder, owning about 90%. The deal could value the world's biggest operator of private jet bases at $4.3 billion. Signature also said the Carlyle Group is considering an offer suggesting a potential bidding war. And that's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Francine.
Thank you so much, Leanne. Now, this is the picture for the markets. A lot of the focus, of course, is on the reflation trade. The focus is on what we'll see from Congress and trying to figure out exactly what comes once Inauguration Day is upon us. Stocks are rising. U.S. futures also rising ahead of Jobs Day. Bitcoin dropping after topping $40,000. Crude oil up a touch. Bloomberg Surveillance. More of that next.
Another day of risk off across the financial markets. We bring you special coverage of all the price action and implications here on Bloomberg Television.
Democratic leaders call for President Trump to be removed from office for inciting the Capitol chaos. The clock ticks, 12 days left in his administration. Donald Trump finally concedes that Joe Biden will be the next president. Meanwhile, there are reports that the president is considering pardoning himself, as well as a sweeping list of other individuals. And global stocks continue to climb after U.S. equities close at an all-time highs. Traders bet on additional stimulus, and it's also Jobs Day. Well, good morning, everyone. This is Bloomberg Surveillance. As always, Tom and Francine from London and New York. Tom, a bit quieter today, certainly on the political front after the last 72 hours. If you look at the markets, there's still the reflation trade going on. They're looking at stimulus, and they're expecting a lot more quiet after January 20th. And what's interesting is not only looking at oil, but also Bitcoin, briefly touching $40,000.
Yeah, I'll give you Bitcoin touching 40,000. I believe we're going to do a spot on that right now. But Francine, rather than tired or quieter, I would say people are just simply exhausted waiting for the news flow to January 20th. Today, folks, we're going to try to do a little bit less on the politics because we have that distraction of that jobs report. Francine, I'm not going to mince words. The latest jobs data is pretty grim.
Yeah, it certainly is. Of course, we have to try and figure out whether it's related to lockdown or whether it's something, underlying, something a little bit deeper. You're right, people are exhausted, Tom, but if you're a portfolio manager in charge of $2 trillion, exhausted or not, you have to make the right bets on the markets. Now let's get straight to the Bloomberg First Word News in New York City. Here's Ritika Gupta. Hi, Ritika.
Thanks, Francine. President Trump is now condemning the attack on the U.S. Capitol, which happened after he egged on his angry supporters to take action. In a video released last night, the president said that those demonstrators defiled the seat of American democracy, and he promised to pursue a smooth transition to the Biden administration. Meanwhile, President Trump is coming under more pressure. He's facing calls to resign, talks of impeachment, and a push for Vice President Mike Pence to take constitutional steps to force him from office. Democratic congressional leaders say Pence and the Trump cabinet should invoke the 25th Amendment. That provides a way for the president to be removed. Pence hasn't responded. Another Trump cabinet member has resigned over the riot at the Capitol. Education Secretary Betsy DeVos squarely laid the blame for the mayhem at the feet of the president. She said the president's rhetoric was, quote, the inflection point for me. Earlier, Transportation Secretary Elaine Chao quit, calling the assault on the Capitol traumatic. She is married to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. The UK has now imposed mandatory coronavirus testing on all incoming travellers. They'll have to show a negative test result taken within 72 hours of the start of their journey. And those arriving from countries not on the UK's open travel corridor list will have to isolate at home for 10 days, regardless of their test results. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. Tom?
Ritika, thanks so much. It is an interesting and nuanced data check today. As Francine mentions, Bitcoin with a 40,000 print, 39,400 right now. Gold pulls back. It's fascinating to see where gold is given all. 1891 the ounce. Yes, yields are up 1.08%, rounded up on the 10-year yield. Inflation expectations rising as well. Steve Englander of Standard Charter, without question, the research noted this morning. And Francine, he is heated in looking at the data that the inflation expectations are driven off dollar and driven off oil, not so much rising economic inflation. I thought it was a fascinating note. Futures up 11. Francine.
Yeah, if you look at European stocks, they're actually headed down for their best weekly gain since November. I'm looking at tech shares. They're boosted also by earnings reports from Asian chip makers, but also U.S. chip makers. Now, the other thing, of course, and I know we have to just be a bit careful, talking about rising stocks because they are rising, but it's also nothing that huge. But there is a clear indication from investors that they're betting a Democratic control of the Senate will give Joe Biden greater power to battle the economic slowdown spurred by the pandemic, including stimulus checks. The dollar erasing gains, 10-year Treasury yields pretty much flat. Now, after facing calls for the removal from several prominent Democrats, President Trump released a video last night from the White House.
I am outraged by the violence, lawlessness, and mayhem. The demonstrators who infiltrated the Capitol have defiled the seat of American democracy. To those who engaged in the acts of violence and destruction, you do not represent our country, and to those who broke the law, you will pay. We have just been through an intense election and emotions are high, but now tempers must be cooled and calm restored. A new administration will be inaugurated on January 20th. My focus now turns to ensuring a smooth, orderly, and seamless transition of power. This moment calls for healing and reconciliation. I know you are disappointed, but I also want you to know that our incredible journey is only just beginning.
Well, joining us now is Greg Valliere, AGF Investment Chief U.S. Policy Strategist. Greg, what's changed in U.S. politics after January 6, 2021? Is Donald Trump now out of mainstream, Republican politics?
Well, I think there are two big changes, Francine. Number one, you now have the Democrats controlling both houses, not by a lot, but they control them. And I think the prospects for a bigger stimulus bill later this winter have increased quite a bit. Number two, the threats just overnight to impeach Trump, to use the 25th Amendment, to somehow drive him out of office, even the Wall Street Journal calling for his resignation, I think that has now forced Trump to concede the obvious.
So, Greg, what does that mean for the Republican Party going forward?
Oh, tremendous fissure, tremendous division within the party. At the grassroots, Trump is still very popular, but I think the mainstream party, let's say the Mitch McConnell party, realizes that he is an albatross, that Trump could bring the entire party down. They have to begin to move away from him aggressively.
Greg Valliere, good morning. The Republican Party of your Granite State goes back to 1853, and there's been evolution, some ugly, some not so ugly, through the years. How does the Republican Party of Senator Hawley of Missouri move forward?
It's going to be really difficult. I'd throw Ted Cruz into that mix as well, Tom. I think that they have a lot to answer for. They need to look in the mirror and assess their role in all of this. I think that over the next several months, you'll see the emergence of really two parties, a moderate Republican Party and the Trump Party. It's going to be a while before those two wings are reconciled.
Well, come on, Greg. They're not going to be reconciled after what we saw yesterday. Yeah. The Secretary of Education, the Secretary of Transportation resigned. Who knows who's going to resign today? I'm fascinated, Greg, by your expertise in the primary process to 2022. What is the Hawley machine? I'm going back here, folks, to New York City politics, but the Hawley machine, the Cruz machine, how do they prosecute the primaries of 2022?
It's going to be very difficult, but I would just point out, Tom, yesterday the Republicans began their national convention, which had been scheduled for quite some time. Trump still received a rapturous response when he called in. So it's not like the entire grassroots party is going to turn against him.
Greg, when you look at, what happens to the Joe Biden administration to try and unify the country, what do people want? I mean, is it stimulus? I know you talk about, coming together and politicians need to do that, but what will actually make Trump's base appeased with what's going on?
Well, they probably won't be, but I think what the country needs now, even more than a stimulus bill, and after yesterday's jobs report, the need for a stimulus bill is still quite apparent. I think the country just needs some stability, some peace and quiet, some sense from this very low-key Joe Biden that he has a normal ego, that he doesn't have a Trumpian ego. I think the country is just looking for a period of stability.
Greg, how many people think that the election was fair? Do we need to spend a bit more time just trying to look at American citizens, because that will give us an indication of what comes next?
Well, Trump's concession last night, as belated as it was, is important because it's a signal to his supporters that he has conceded. That's a good thing. It'll be a while. There'll still be this lingering resentment. But I think we need to move on to the economy. And lest we forget, the fatalities just yesterday from COVID were an all-time daily high. So we're not out of the woods on that either. We need to focus on those things rather than the lunacy of an election fraud which did not exist.
Greg, give us a vignette of your Washington of the last 48 hours. You were ensconced in fancy luxury digs in Washington as well. Just give us one little Valier touch of what you witnessed over the last 48 hours.
People were shocked. They were sickened by what happened. But I think now, as we get to Friday, people are exhausted. The emotional exhaustion from such an extraordinary attack on our institutions will persist for a while. That's why I think Joe Biden is the antidote. He's low-keyed. We need somebody like that for a while who doesn't make crazy charges.
The gentleman from New Hampshire, Greg Valier, thank you so much for joining us from his Washington, D.C. this morning, of course, with AGF Investments. We love his morning research note. Get that through AGF. We always protect the copyright of our guests. One of those has the wonderful copyright of the Council on Foreign Relations. Richard Haas is the president of CFR. Can't say enough about my book of the summer. It's still a book of the winter. Richard Haas, The World, and It Is a Changed World. Ambassador Haas in the 6 o'clock hour. This is Bloomberg.
The United States has squandered its moral authority.
It's quite clear to the public that this is a president who has actively encouraged this kind of behavior, because if he hadn't, it wouldn't take place.
This is not a case where you're dealing with something that came with no warning or there was no intelligence. If you opened the newspaper over the last week, you saw they were boasting about coming to Washington, to use the president's word, going wild.
Don't dare call them protesters. They were a riotous mob, insurrectionists, domestic terrorists.
Certainly the people who did it are responsible for their own actions, but I think the president needs to do some introspection as to whether or not what he did yesterday contributed to it, what his family did.
Business leaders who gave money to this man repeatedly when it was known, or they should have known, where this would end, not only financed him, supported him, believing that they would enrich themselves. And I find it really very, very disappointing behavior.
American democracy will survive, and none of our leaders will be intimidated.
He unleashed an all-out assault on our institutions of our democracy from the outset. And yesterday was but the culmination of that unrelenting attack.
I join the Senate Democratic leader in calling on the Vice President to remove this president by immediately invoking the 25th Amendment.
As to the 25th Amendment being invoked, I do not believe that's appropriate at this point.
The blur of voices and what we try to do at Bloomberg is synthesize and constrain those voices down to common sense that we can listen to on both sides of the aisle. Yesterday, to have Dr. Dean with us from the Democrats and Andrew Card from the Republicans, just one example of what we're trying to accomplish. Francine and I, Lisa, John Farrow and all, we're just blown away by what our team has done over the last 48 hours. Right now, we are going to drag ourselves to the research zeitgeist of the moment. The fervor of research on this Friday morning is extraordinary, and we're thrilled to have Jeremy Stretch with us at CIBC. Jeremy, the basic theme I'm hearing from Standard Chartered, from High Frequency Economics, from Credit Suisse, and from CIBC is, what kind of inflation is this that we're seeing? And what they're saying is horse and cart, cart and horse, that the movements in oil and the movements in dollar are what are affecting us to a belief of higher inflation. As Carl Weinberg says, it may look like inflation. Is the inflation real, Jeremy Stretch, or is it just dollar and oil dynamics?
Well, certainly you're right to put the finger on the oil price and dollar dynamics being key to the inflationary or potential inflationary spike. But of course, it's not just that. It is that broader reflationary theme that we're seeing globally. So we're seeing that in other commodity prices as well, such as iron ore and copper to an extent as well. So we're seeing commodity prices moving up, and it is very much on the predication that calendar year 2021 will be much better from a growth and a GDP perspective than calendar year 2020. So it is still this presumption that we are going to see stronger growth dynamics playing out. We're seeing that reflected in terms of the moves in bond yields.
Right.
And I think the question is how much further can the dollar go as we continue to see this backdrop playing out?
Well, as you do, Jeremy, you absolutely nail it in terms of growth prospects. Stephen Englander, folks at Standard Chartered, just flat out, he disagrees on the inflation surge and feels it's the dollar dynamics and oil dynamics as well. But Jeremy Stretch, you fold in the growth of 2021. Is that a true growthiness, or is it just a pandemic rebound growthiness?
Well, that is a very good point. And of course, an optimist would argue, well, even a rebound from the pandemic growth pessimism of 2020 is to be encouraged. But I think there is this realization that we are going to have to do the hard yards to take back all of that, well, part of that macro destruction that we saw through the course of last year. We will continue to see that in the context of employment, and of course that's notable in terms of non-farms today. So it is going to be a case of a series of hard yards to take back last year's destruction, and I think over the medium run into 2022 and onwards, then we can start to see a more growth-orientated backdrop, which is not purely or largely exclusively the rebound potential from the losses that we saw through the course of last year.
Jeremy, in the FX space, where do you see the most excitement in the year to come?
Well, I think we are going to see those higher beta or commodity-orientated currencies continuing to perform well, and I think in the context of the majors and in terms of the G3, we are going to see plenty of weakness coming through in terms of or some uncertainty in terms of some of those majors. So I think it's going to be a case of looking for the high beta currency. So in Europe, it's probably Sweden and Norway. In Australasia, it's probably the Aussie and the Kiwi. I think all of those currencies are going to perform relatively well against the majors, which I think could well struggle somewhat.
Does renminbi actually move on the back of some of the events that we saw in Washington, because they're going to take this as an opportunity to do more when there's a bit of a political vacuum in Washington?
Well, that's an interesting point. And in a sense, I think that's one of the context of the outcomes of the election process is the fact that it does look as though China is a net beneficiary of the uncertainties that we've been seeing writ large by the political dynamics in the US, and the rebound potential that's been much more dynamic and much more aggressive in terms of China as well. I think that also is played into the narrative of the recovery play being much more entrenched in that part of the world and in that region. So I think it is going to be the case that we are going to continue to see the currency gaining relatively broadly throughout 2021 and into 2022. So I think we are going to continue to see dollar CNH moving lower. However, having said that, I think we are still going to get an Biden administration, which is not going to be soft on China, but I think we're not going to get those knee-jerk, more reactive and more emotive reactions that, of course, have characterized the last 4 years of the Trump-led administration.
Jeremy Stretch will continue with us full circle on the dollar this week to dollar's weakness, rather, that we had in 2 days now of dollar strength, right back up to a 90 DXY, which is an important level. That yuan, I'll come back and talk about that with Mr. Stretch, 6.46. That's a stunning statistic on the Chinese renminbi. It is Jobs Day in America. So many people to join us here as we move to the 8:30 hour. We start strong with James Glassman, JP Morgan Chase. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.
We have some good news in terms of vaccines and a chance to overcome the health crisis, but we are not there yet.
We need the fiscal stimulus, and we need it relatively quickly, because I can see where the second wave's coming. You can see consumer spending beginning to get impacted again.
What we need surveillance to be stronger. We need public health measures, because you have no other way at the beginning. This is your best weapon, and you need to use it well.
The good news is that both the vaccines and the therapeutics, in particular the antibodies, are coming along and will start to bring that number way down.
We don't just need more investment in public health. We must also rethink how we value health.
I do believe a targeted fiscal stimulus is going to be in order to really begin a more equalized economy.
Substantial further progress means what it says. We'll be looking for an inflation to be substantially closer to our 2% longer run goal before we start making adjustments to our purchases.
That's a long time to be very accommodative, but that's basically the horizon.
They can buy more bonds, and they can buy longer maturity bonds, and that would put more downward pressure on long-term interest rates.
Their CPG history, their experience, and really how we might be able to combine together to really create this fantastic public company. And so we kind of got into the SPAC thing a little bit before it became such a hot method of going public.
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Ritika Gupta with the Bloomberg Business Flash. Credit Suisse expects to report a loss in the fourth quarter. The Swiss bank is setting aside another $850 million to cover potential settlements related to residential mortgage-backed securities. That's more than twice the amount Credit Suisse had suggested last month. Boeing has agreed to settle a criminal fraud charge over the 737 MAX by paying $2.5 billion. The Justice Department had accused the plane maker of defrauding the government by concealing information about the jet. The 737 MAX was involved in 2 fatal crashes that killed 346 people. And China is signaling how the controversy over Alibaba has become a matter of national political sensitivity. According to the Financial Times, local news media has been ordered to censor reports about an antitrust investigation into the online retailer. Alibaba has become the most prominent target of China's campaign against the tech industry. And that is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Tom?
Ritika, thanks so much. Up in the equity market, up on Bitcoin as well. Futures up 12, Dow futures up 96. The VIX is stunning 22.46. That's in 7 big figures over the week as well. Bitcoin, Francine sold it at 40,000, 39,607 on Bitcoin. Good morning, Matt Miller in Berlin. 10-year yield 1.08%. Francine, I got 3 hours sleep. I'm well rested.
3 hours and a half for Tom Keene. That's a full night's sleep compared to what he's had earlier this week. Tom, Bitcoin, I'm still trying to understand it, but certainly there's, it's capturing the imagination, I would say, of more fund managers than in the past. Bitcoin dropping now, but it did touch $40,000. I'm also looking at crude oil edging higher. Look, overall, we had a good conversation a bit earlier on also with Scott Thiel talking about treasury yields, the dollar erasing gains. If you look at the treasury yield, they're flat at the moment, but they seem to be range bound. And then we also had a conversation, Tom, with Carl Bildt, and he was saying, look, the only question that the market really needs to have is whether the Trump presidency was, 4 years out of the ordinary, or whether the Biden presidency will be the 4 years out of the ordinary.
You have so hit the third rail of questioning in America right now.
And that, I know, and that is actually the one thing that we'll spend maybe a bit more time on. Now, coming up on Balance of Power, Dr. Stephen Corwin, New York Presbyterian Hospital President and Chief Executive. This is Bloomberg. explore the trends, investments, and competition of the European ETF industry. Join us on Bloomberg ETF IQ Europe.
I don't really see it impacting the need for monetary policy to be there to support the recovery, because I don't think we're going to be necessarily back to our goals in short stead. I think this is a real journey, not a sprint.
Well, that was the Cleveland Fed President, Loretta Mester, speaking to our Kathleen Hayes. Now let's get back to Jeremy Stretch of CIBC, who's still with us. Jeremy, we were talking a little bit before, of course, about dollar dynamics, about the trajectory for dollar and what you thought it would take for the Fed to start normalizing interest rates. Is there anything in the U.S. economy that you would really worry about? I mean, if there's a downturn, do you see it in jobs first? I know that the numbers are a bit sketchy given the lockdowns at the moment, or do you see it elsewhere in consumption?
Well, I think consumption is likely to flow out of what happens in the labour market. So I think the labour market is still going to be the integral factor in terms of the broader perspective, because, of course, if there is a fear about joblessness, then that has an impact in terms of consumption and consumer behaviour. So I think we need to see some degree of resilience playing out in the labour market over the medium run. Now, of course, that's going to be an interesting dynamic in the context today, where we're actually expecting a small fall in the level of employment and an uptick in the unemployment rate. The question is whether this retreat is going to be extended throughout the first quarter, and then perhaps as the vaccine rollout plays out, can we see some degree of optimism starting to kick back into the market through the course of real economy rebound into the second and third quarters?
Are we too optimistic about the vaccine rollout, Jeremy? It seems that every 3 weeks there are questions about new strains, about whether these vaccines work, but just simply on how long these vaccines last and the distribution in the meantime.
Well, I think there is a risk that we are somewhat priced to perfection in terms of the vaccine rollout. Now, of course, we all hope that the vaccine rollout goes smoothly, and we also hope that the vaccines can deal with these ongoing strains and mutations, as inevitably as happens with these kind of viruses. But I think there is this risk that there could well be some uncertainties ahead. Now, of course, we have this mass vaccination rollout happening both here in the UK, but also across many other jurisdictions, and that isn't going to be a smooth process. And so it is going to be the case that we will potentially get some negative news, and that may well imply that this sort of optimism that we've seen coming through in both the equity space in the early part of this year, but also this significant move up in yields at the longer end and steepening of the curve might be a little bit preemptive. So it could well be, as I say, a case where the market is a little bit priced for perfection, at least at this very early stage of the year.
Jeremy, one final question. We have to go to some breaking news. Jeremy Stretch, where's the opportunity here in a given currency pair? What's a single pair where you see big figure moves?
Well, as I've mentioned earlier, I think it is all about those commodity-orientated currencies.
Right. Which one?
We like Aussie, we like Kiwi, and I think we also like the Noki. So I think those would be the three that I would probably really highlight for potential gains against the majors, the low yielders.
Very good. Jeremy Stretch, thank you so much with CIBC.
Thanks
Just
so much,
wonderful
Tom.
there on foreign exchange and really quite good on the economics of the moment as well. There are headlines now from a troubled German bank. And all my radar's up on this, and we've got a wonderful team who bounce off here. Jonathan Tice, Eliza Martinuzzi, Lionel Laurent. But with the Credit Suisse news earlier, Francine, and now with Commerce Bank, and the key word there, folks, is fully. They will fully write off existing goodwill. I have been trained, Francine, that when you see headlines like this, it's cleaning up the accounts before some form of transactions and combinations. I find these to be the most interesting headlines from Commerce Bank as they clean up the balance sheet.
Well, Tommy, the time, I would suggest, blends into one, but it's been like 3 or 4 years that we've been talking about possible consolidation.
Yes.
And first it was the regulators. No, they didn't want the consolidation. Then it was the share price. So it was too high. But when you look at the persistent low interest rate environment that a lot of these European companies and European banks have to operate in, with the low growth, with the pressure to actually give out loans because of COVID-19, at some point, the pressure cooker has to give in. Now, whether that means writing off or whether it means consolidating, at some point, all of our talk about consolidation will come to fruition. It just has to.
Francine, you have the best view of Credit Suisse of Zurich of anyone in business media. What is your interpretation of the Credit Suisse further write-downs today, or I should say further losses?
Well, Tom, there was for many years and for many quarters a lot of the talk, of course, on some of the loans that they gave out. Now, this is directly linked to, of course, what we heard, 3-4 quarters ago, which was the RMBS case. So it's now expecting a fourth quarter loss linked to that case. I think the main question is whether there's anything else that they have to write off in provision. That's the million-dollar question, which I'm sure reporters are digging around, but also the company itself wants to make sure that there's not another surprise after this one.
Francine, we call that in the CFA Institute kitchen sink accounting. There's something about the kitchen sink right now. 2 European banks with some serious news there. With our news in New York City is Ritika Gupta.
Thanks, Tom. A day after he urged his angry supporters to take action, President Trump condemned the storming of the U.S. Capitol. In a video released last night, the president accused the mob of defiling the seat of U.S. democracy. He also said he would now turn his focus to ensuring a smooth, orderly, and seamless transition of power. A Capitol police officer has died of injuries suffered when a pro-Trump mob stormed the building. Authorities say the officer was hurt while engaging with protesters. Meanwhile, the chief of the Capitol Police has resigned. The force has come under fire for lack of preparation. And President Trump is preparing a sweeping list of pardons for his final days in office. Bloomberg's learned the list includes senior White House officials, family members, prominent rappers, and possibly himself. A president's legal power to pardon himself isn't made clear in the Constitution, though. And coronavirus deaths in the U.S. are likely to maintain a near-record pace through January. According to the CDC, the U.S. will end the month averaging about 2,600 deaths a day. By the time Joe Biden is inaugurated January the 20th, the nation's death toll is likely to surpass 400,000. Global News 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. Francine, Tom.
Hi, Ritika. Thanks so much. It is Jobs Day in America, but before that, we will look at the various moments of our politics. Ambassador Haas will join us. Richard Haas of the Council on Foreign Relations. Moving to Jobs Day, we are thrilled that Ellen Zentner will join us. She has been exceptionally cautious on measured rebounds of GDP. We'll look at our underemployment, our unemployment across America. Please stay with us. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.
generation's biggest problem.
Climate change is happening.
And the world's most innovative solutions.
Transport, industry, buildings, electricity, all of those things.
Everything you need to know about our changing environment, the politics of global warming.
We can and we will deal with climate change.
In the fight against climate change, Bloomberg Green has you covered.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Ritika Gupta with your Bloomberg Business Flash. Cryptocurrencies are on track for their biggest weekly surge since about 3 years ago. The Bloomberg Galaxy Crypto Index has rallied roughly 40% this week. It includes Bitcoin, Ether, and 3 other digital coins. Bitcoin broke through 40,000 for the first time yesterday. The last time digital coins rallied like this was in 2017, just before a spectacular crash. Simon & Schuster has cancelled plans to publish a book by Republican Senator Josh Hawley. The company cited his connection to the effort to overturn the election of Joe Biden that turned violent on Wednesday. Hawley calls the move a direct assault on the First Amendment, and he plans to go to court. And viewers in the US flocked to CNN's coverage of the storming of the US Capitol. The result, the most watched day in the cable channel's history. More than 5.2 million viewers tuned into CNN on Wednesday to see images of the riot. CNN beat Fox News and MSNBC in total viewers and in the 25 to 54 demographic that advertisers love. CNN is owned by AT&T. And that is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Tom, Francine?
Ritika, thanks so much. How about a chart on Bitcoin? And the example here, folks, is the y-axis, which is the normal chart, arithmetic, or logs, which show percent change. This is not the Bitcoin chart you're used to seeing. It is a logarithmic chart which shows the percent change slope matters of Bitcoin. And even with that, notice the curve over on the right side, which is the acceleration up to 40,000 in Bitcoin. As Ritika just mentioned, we saw in 2017. Always logarithmic. Edward Vanderwald is with us. Eddie, good morning here on Bitcoin. What have you learned about Bitcoin in the last week?
Tom, I'm absolutely heartbroken. I had a whole spiel set up about the parabolic, Bitcoin going parabolic on a log scale chart, and you've just stolen it from me. But I think, look, this is something that we've seen over time. There's not many asset classes that can do that. Bitcoin up 33% in the last 7 days, 20% up in the previous 7 days. I spoke to a new Bitcoin investor who went long for the first time just before Christmas, and I checked in with them to see what they think at the moment. They said, look, it's obscene the amount of money they're making. But here's the thing, you know, as spectacular as the upside is, the crashes are equally spectacular. Timing is absolutely everything in this asset class. You got it right in 2017, you made 3,000%. You got it wrong, and you ended up with virtually nothing, right? You were down like 80%. So timing is everything, and the question is, we are starting to see this chart curving upwards on that log scale chart. So whether we are setting up for one of those crashes.
Okay, I love it, Eddie. And let's go to the parabolic moment here, folks. I'm not going to go into the geometry this morning, but all you got to know is we've got massive curvature and acceleration in Bitcoin. Eddie Vanderwald, who is on the bid creating that acceleration? Which institutional force, which category of Bitcoin owner is making for the parabolic Vanderwalt move?
Yeah, well, it's now the Vanderwalt Keen move. But listen, I think we've definitely seen some institutional money coming into this space, but also some, small investors that previously were not as tech savvy and didn't have the nous to set up a link to a Bitcoin exchange and all of that. They can now buy it via PayPal or in the
You're kidding! I didn't know that. Francine.
No, yeah.
Oh, Francine, stop.
That's Ethereum and all of that.
Francine, that's a birthday gift for one of the offspring. You can PayPal Bitcoin.
Matt Miller taught me all I need to know about Bitcoin a long time ago is remember your password. I am not the best to remember passwords, so it's probably not one for the Lacqua household. Eddie, if you have more institutional investors going in at Bitcoin, is the only way up for Bitcoin up?
No, definitely not. Definitely not. This asset class has shown that it can spectacularly collapse. And if you get it wrong, we could see something like 2017. And here's the thing, these new tools that we're seeing in Bitcoin, like the futures contract on CME, they also make it possible to short. And remember, the last time that Bitcoin crashed was the day that the futures contract was actually launched. Was the top for Bitcoin. Now, one thing about the futures market, in a purely speculative asset, the futures contract is a perfect substitute for the underlying, because if all you want is price exposure, then the futures contract is a perfect substitute. So therefore, potentially that could be a venue to bring this thing down spectacularly.
Okay, is Bitcoin now mainstream, Eddie? And if it is, does it make a difference?
I think I think it is mainstream in the sense that a mainstream investor can get access to it. But I do not think that Bitcoin is at all systemic. I think if we see a Bitcoin collapse, right, I still don't think we see contagion across asset classes. I still don't think the gold price moves on it, and I still don't think the dollar moves on it. So therefore, it kind of doesn't matter. So in a sense, yes, it's mainstream that it is available to everybody, but it is not mainstream in the sense that everybody owns it, everybody should own it, and it's going to impact every portfolio out there.
All right, Eddie, thanks so much. Eddie van der Veld there, our Markets Live editor. Tom doesn't know he also speaks philosophy, so maybe we'll get him on philosophy the next time he comes on Surveillance. Up next, we speak, of course, about the top risks of Eurasia for 2021. We look at capital riots. We look at what it means for Europe with Mij Rahman, Eurasia Group Managing Director for Europe. This is Bloomberg.
新型にはなんと2万点以上前進でついてます。なので2万点あることにより、その情報が取れない、平面がないんですね。なので全てをスキャンすることができるので。どちらにせよ自分のサイズを1回最初から、適正なものを発見してそれを買って、家に届いてきたらぴったり非常にハッピーというのがやっぱりしかるべき姿かなと思ってます。
What do you think you would like to do when your term as Secretary of State is completed?
David, I think I've answered all your questions. I may kick this one. I don't know precisely what I'll do.
This is a market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London, Tom Keane in New York. Now, Eurasia Group is expecting Europe to fall into a leadership deficit following German Chancellor Angela Merkel's departure later this year. In its top risks report, she is deemed Europe's most important leader, setting the stage for the EU to secure its $750 billion recovery fund. Well, joining us now is Mij Rahman. He's Eurasia Group Managing Director for Europe. Mij, what comes after Angela Merkel, first of all, and is there a de facto transfer of the access to France alone?
Thanks, Francine. So great to be with you to kind of walk through this risk. I think it hangs on Angela Merkel finally leaving domestic politics in Germany, finally leaving the leadership role that she has de facto played for the EU for the last 15 years. But it's more complex than Merkel simply leaving. I think there's also a piece that relates to the French election. If you think about the German and French election cycles, what we're effectively going to see, I think, this year is Merkel looking inward, looking towards the re-election and trying to ensure a strong result for her CDU in September. But when the new German Chancellor emerges, that's when Macron will begin to look inward and begin to focus on his re-election. And if you think about the situation in France, Macron is confronting an economic crisis, a health crisis, a security crisis. So I think that's the problem for Europe over the next year and a half. You don't get that symbiotic Franco-German leadership that has been so important for everything that's been done over the last few years.
But is there a longer-term problem that will be decided in the next year? If COVID is not dealt with in the right way, if austerity measures come too soon, are we going to have a wave of populism and a wave of, far-right or far-left leaders in Europe?
So there's definitely, COVID is obviously casting a very long shadow. We're going to see that reverberate in the economy. I think you'll see a lot of that manifest this year. So that's absolutely a risk. So there's fertile ground for populism to grow in Europe. I think that's absolutely the case. Whether or not it succeeds, I think, in very large part will hang on effective implementation or not of the recovery fund. So Europe has put in place a framework that should allow it to deal with the economic fallout of COVID, but whether it gets implemented properly, whether that drives growth, I think those questions are unanswered and remain to be seen.
Mr. Rahman, Tom Keene in New York, wonderful to have you with us. Dr. Bremer has given us Washington perspective this week. And if we look at the collected grievances or the many angers of the far right in America or just the right in America, a conservative voice in America, we can bring it right over to Europe. Frame the grievances and tone of a disaffected right across the many nations of Europe.
So, Tom, I think, Europe's actually in a pretty interesting situation at the moment. If you look at the large countries, the disaffected right is actually, I would argue, as a minority, actually shrinking. If you think about where the AfD is in Germany, if you think about where Le Pen is in France, if you look at Keir Starmer reclaiming the centre ground of British politics, I actually think the centre is holding and growing. Now, whether that remains to be seen, I think depends on whether or not we get out a third lockdown, whether leaders are capable of dealing with the concomitant unemployment and economic crisis. But politically, the centre is arguably growing in the EU in a way that is perhaps a bit surprising.
Then when you look over through the Eurasia Group prism to America, is the angst of America because we're not doing the income replacement or income substitution in this crisis like Europe, so we get the results like the shock of Washington?
Yes, and there's definitely, Tom, there's definitely a very live debate now in Europe about the extent to which the EU going forward can depend on the US. I think France is clearly of the view that the Europeans basically have to go it alone. They need to hedge, and you see that reflected through the China deal that was signed at the end of last year, through Macron's commitment to this thing he calls strategic autonomy. Europe needs to do its own thing, needs to be its own geopolitical player, needs to maintain its own voice in the world. I think in Germany, the debate's a bit less clear. It's a bit more divided, but certainly what has happened on Wednesday evening in Washington does give EU leaders more pause for thought about the extent to which they can depend on America going forward, or whether they need to take more responsibility for themselves.
But, Mirja, how should Europe actually deal with China? Is there a danger that because they can't count on the U.S. as much as they used to, that actually the region becomes too close to China, almost subservient?
So I think Merkel's strategy, Francine, was to try and introduce a bit more coherence into the relationship with China, because there is a concern that the Chinese are picking off the weaker member states, and they're doing that through capital, whether that's in Southern Europe, whether that's in Central or Eastern Europe. And the investment agreement is meant to really be a building block that then enables a much broader and deeper conversation with the Chinese that's managed through the European level. So it's meant to be a kind of initial discussion and an attempt by the EU to try and introduce a bit more coherence into its policy on China.
Mitch, very quickly, is Turkey part of Europe?
Absolutely, absolutely, Tom. I mean, there's no desire at the moment within Europe to really move forward with this process of Turkish integration. Obviously, you'll be talking to Naz later and the team on the Turkey risk this year. There's big political and economic challenges there. But I do think there is a desire to maintain some dialogue, but not move meaningfully closer in terms of a partnership agreement. But there's lots of areas of cooperation, obviously, with Turkey. For the two sides.
Mitch, thank you so much. Mitch Rahman with us, Eurasia Group. And folks, it's been a spectacular week of perspective from Eurasia Group. We thank Cliff Kupchan and Ian Bremer for the perspective of their top risks of 2021. One of our risks is not to get distracted. We staggered at 8:30 in what is believed to be a challenging labor report in the United States. It is amazing, Francine, to see the deterioration from the November report out to this morning's December report.
Yes, Tom. Of course, you need to put it in perspective because of the various lockdowns. So again, you wonder how much of a focus this will give us. This will be able to give us in terms of what the economy is going through, or whether it's just a couple of months blip. But certainly, it could move dollar and could definitely move treasuries.
And also move treasuries. And Jeff Rosenberg of BlackRock will be joining us, I believe, here some way along the morning. Coming up next, James Glassman with us with J.P. Morgan Chase. Just a wonderful ability to get the pulse of the many J.P. Morgan contacts nationwide. Jim Glassman will join us on a challenging jobs report. Futures up 12, Dow futures up 93. Bitcoin, a hat trick of Bitcoin quotes. Bitcoin, 40,677.
This is Bloomberg Best, your weekly review of the most important business news, analysis, and interviews from Bloomberg Television around the world.
Ken Burns, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions.
We have always been a mixture of things. We are always stronger for that mixture.
Growth is a way to stay competitive, delight more and more consumers.
Are you worried that people won't take the vaccine?
We remain concerned about vaccine hesitancy.
What is one word of advice you'll take with you?
Learn how to listen. And that is certainly something that has served me well.
Ankiti, where do you go from here? It's a huge market. It's a huge opportunity. I want to go 100x from here.
Our philosophy is to partner where we can and stand apart when we should.
this morning, the clock is ticking. Democrats and select Republicans, they consider the ousting of the president. Mr. Trump looks out 12 days to a, quote, smooth, orderly, and seamless transition. The clock, it is still ticking as the virus rages. America nears 4,000 deaths per day. China locks down a city of 11 million. And the clock, it is ticking for the and the underemployed of America. This jobs day, is the unemployment rate really 12% plus? Good morning, everyone. Bloomberg Surveillance after an exhausting week, and we say thank you to our team in London, in New York, and particularly in Washington for getting us to this Friday. Francine, it's Jobs Day. We'll have great coverage. Ellen Zentner to join from Morgan Stanley. Jim Glassman comes along in a bit. Francine, tell us of the interpretation of Washington from your London.
Well, Tom, we saw, of course, a lot of debates yesterday between Boris Johnson, the leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer, on the relationship that the UK, now that Brexit is done, has to have with the US and other parts of the world. I think a lot of world leaders, Tom, will want to move on from the Capitol riots with, of course, let's remember, 4 or even 5 deaths, I believe, which, is pretty shocking from where we're sitting. But overall, world leaders, Tom, want to move away from it because they now see it as a US problem given what's happening in the Republican Party. And so I think there's, not a shying away, but we've said what we thought. This was wrong. There needs to be a peaceful transition.
Right.
We saw it from von der Leyen and others. And now they need to focus more on domestic things here in Europe as well.
Well, you mentioned domestic things in Europe. I want to get this in, Francine, because it's so important to global Wall Street. The shock of a Credit Suisse loss, the shock of a Commerce Bank write-down, these are early signals of challenged banking in Europe.
Yeah, early signals, but then, Tom, we've also known that, the banks have been challenged for quite some time. If you look at the low interest rate environment and how many years they've had to deal with, now with the extra pressure on having to give loans. Look, this is something related to RMBS. Okay, we'll look at Credit Suisse, but if you look at what these European banks are, they're just not the same level of US. So at some point, it will have to come to a head.
At some point it will, and of course that within the negative rate environment. With our first word news, here's Ritika Gupta.
Thanks, Tom. President Trump is now condemning the attack on the U.S. Capitol, which happened after he egged on his angry supporters to take action. In a video released last night, the president said that those demonstrators defiled the seat of American democracy, and he promised to pursue a smooth transition to the Biden administration. Meanwhile, President Trump is coming under more pressure. He's facing calls to resign, talks of impeachment, and a push for Vice President Mike Pence to take constitutional steps to force him from office. Democratic congressional leaders say Pence and the Trump cabinet should invoke the 25th Amendment that provides a way for a president to be removed. Pence hasn't responded. Another Trump cabinet member has resigned over the riots at the Capitol. Education Secretary Betsy DeVos squarely laid the blame for the mayhem at the feet of the president. She said the president's rhetoric was, quote, the inflection point for me. Earlier, Transportation Secretary Elaine Chao quit, calling the assault on the Capitol traumatic. She is married to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. The UK has now imposed mandatory coronavirus testing on all incoming travellers. They'll have to show a negative test result taken within 72 hours of the start of their journey. And those arriving from countries not on the UK's open travel corridor list will have to isolate at home for 10 days, regardless of their test results. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. Tom.
Ritika, thanks so much. Equities, bonds, currencies, commodities, and Bitcoin. We'll get to Bitcoin in a moment. Futures up 8, Dow futures up 64. The VIX on a tear from 29 into 22.59 now, showing those good equity markets. Yield doesn't play, 1.08%. Currencies with a rebound, stronger dollar over the last 2 days. I thought that was a great conversation, Francine, with Edward Vanderwalt there on Bitcoin. He single-handedly made for a Bitcoin pop 39 out to, we're beckoning 41,000 on the Bitcoin. It's the Vanderwalt parabolic rally.
Yeah, CFA level 4. All right, stocks are rising. U.S. futures also edging higher, but of course it's all about the American jobs data today. It could strengthen the case for a further stimulus under the Democrat-controlled Congress. Bitcoin, as you say, it's dropping after topping 40,000. I mean, if we think about the 40,000 level, again, it feels like every 2 weeks we're going through psychological levels. Crude oil also edging higher, Tom.
With his years in Washington, in managing and an executive capability, the news flow of the last 72 hours is Martin Schenker. He and I need an update, as do you, on the comments of the President of the United States.
I am outraged by the violence, lawlessness, and mayhem. The demonstrators who infiltrated the Capitol have defiled the seat of American democracy. To those who engaged in the acts of violence and destruction, you do not represent our country. And to those who broke the law, you will pay. We have just been through an intense election and emotions are high, but now tempers must be cooled and calm restored. A new administration will be inaugurated on January 20th. My focus now turns to ensuring a smooth, orderly, and seamless transition of power. This moment calls for healing and reconciliation. I know you are disappointed, but I also want you to know that our incredible journey is only just beginning.
Extraordinary video. I was speaking with our team last night in Italy and talking to our video team and thanking McKinnon and all of them for their great work. McKinnon de Kuyper said to me, the white balance was off. Marty Schenker joins us now, our chief editor-at-large, among other things. Marty Schenker, to me, I think McKinnon absolutely nailed it. It was a video that seemed almost pieced together.
Yeah, and actually at one point it was clearly edited. Look, Donald Trump someone has actually gotten to him to understand that his legacy and his political future was at stake.
Can I be so speculative to say the Vice President of the United States said, you have to make this video or I'm going to invoke the 25th Amendment? Is that too gossipy?
It's probably too gossipy. Okay. I think that someone, a family member or a close, not governmental official probably told Donald Trump, look, this is playing extremely badly out here. And he's trying to resurrect whatever semblance of legitimacy he can at the last hours of his administration.
Within all your experience, your years at the Wall Street Journal, assisting Matt Winkler here at Bloomberg News, is January 20th for Washington a cup of coffee away, or is it forever away?
Well, with this presidency, it's forever. But if that video is indicative of Donald Trump truly absorbing the moment, we may see him be extremely quiet over the next 13 days, which will hopefully ratchet down the calls for his departure early. I do not think impeachment, and I do not think the 25th Amendment is going to work here. So it has to be his own self-discipline and the people around him.
Marty, how much division at the moment is there within the Republican Party? Is it, the Republican Party together against President Trump, or, from within, are we seeing fractures?
Oh, it has never been more divided in his presidency than it is right now. There's a report this morning that Kevin McCarthy, who's been one of his most ardent supporters, got in a shouting match with Donald Trump over issuing this statement yesterday. You have two members of his cabinet resigning. You have a distinction between the Senate Republicans and the House Republicans in terms of their view of Donald Trump's presidency. So, yes, the GOP is extremely divided, and it's hard to see how it's going to be cobbled back together anytime soon.
Is there one person that could do that, or will it take, years?
I think it's going to take years. And look, I don't think... obviously Mitch McConnell is one of those people who could possibly do it, but he's getting on in years. If you're looking for a revived GOP, I think you have to look younger. There are some people in the House and the Senate who fit that description, but no one has emerged right now.
There is on Constitution Avenue in Washington a federal courthouse. I would assume that's a lot where the arrests are going to be made, the trials are going to happen as well. Do you just assume, as I'm hearing pretty much within the media that the FBI and other government agencies will be relentless, not over days, but over weeks and months and indeed years to round up the suspects, to take a line from Casablanca?
I absolutely think as the days pass, as we get further out from the incident itself, you can almost palpably sense the anger that is being generated and the calls for consequences for this type of activity. You saw Donald Trump call for that himself. So, yes, I think that there's going to be a retribution for this.
I'm going to put up a fancy chart later, Marty, of the underemployment of America. How do you link the struggle from 2007 and link the struggle of this pandemic into the primal scream of these protesters as have-nots, as people struggling month to month to get to the next paycheck?
There's no question that the inability of this economy to support across all economic groups has contributed to the alienation of people who were at the Capitol the other day. So there is a link between economic well-being and social discontent, and I think you can't ignore it. Now, Donald Trump has not addressed this, and Joe Biden says he will. We'll see.
Marty, does the U.S. have a problem with its police force, and how will it be reformed? We also remember, of course, the number of lives that have been lost because of the riots on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, and I think that especially the loss of a Capitol policeman overnight may have prompted Donald Trump to recognize the seriousness with which this incident puts his presidency at jeopardy. So, yeah, I do think that we do have a problem. Many people have observed the difference in response between this protest and the Black Lives Matter protests. Many commentators have called this response at its core racist. So I think, yes, there is going to be a very deep examination of a relationship between the police and the population.
Marty Schenker, thank you so much. And we say thank you to Billy House and our team at the Capitol here over the last 48 hours. Coming up, Ambassador Haas will join us. My book of the summer, The World. For Richard Haas, it is decidedly a changed world, looking at the last 48 hours. Ambassador Haas, later. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.
Give you a sense of the real-time action. The 10-year yield tumbling now 11 basis points, so continuing in this knee-jerk risk-off feel.
I think what we've seen during this period of time is that communicating via video is not a fad. We are using it in all aspects of our lives, for work, for learning, for communicating, for staying in touch.
really see it impacting the need for monetary policy to be there to support the recovery, because I don't think we're going to be necessarily back to our goals in short stead. I think this is a real journey, not a sprint.
That was Cleveland Fed President Loretta Mester. Now joining us, I can't talk today, Tom.
It's called having the Tom Keenism. I'm sorry, my fault.
Glassman. He's JP Morgan Chase Commercial Banking Head Economist. Jim, always great to have you, especially on a day like today where we not only talk about the reflation trade, possible inflation in the U.S., but we also get that all-important jobs data. First of all, how do you look at jobs in the U.S. right now?
Well, the trends had been improving starting back in the early summer. They've slowed down a bit because of all these new lockdowns. That's the problem. But I think the market is looking past this because we know we've lost some momentum. We know that there's an awful lot of people who dropped out of the market, frankly, when we put these lockdowns in. It's all the folks in the hospitality sector, the airline sector that are struggling. And it's because we're still struggling with this pandemic. But the thing is, in the last several weeks, the mood has changed dramatically in my community, among peers. And I see it, by the way, in a survey we just put out with our business leaders for small businesses. These are the guys that are bearing the brunt of all of these lockdowns. And everybody has become very hopeful. And you know why? Because we finally got yet another fiscal initiative around Christmas, and we're thinking about another one. So in my community, people are beginning to talk about 5-6% growth for GDP over the 4 quarters of this year. If we get that really pretty much brings us back very close to where we were by the end of the year. And that's why I think this is all happening very rapidly, and I think it's taking time for people to sort of digest what this means. But if you look at the revisions in economic forecast from my team, from my colleagues, from around Wall Street, right. There's a whole new story here, and this has been echoed in the equity market, if you ask me.
But Jim, so you're telling me that as soon as we have the vaccine, then actually, the business loss or job losses can go back to work quite quickly, so that will create jobs very fast.
Yes, because that's the problem. We're having to impose new lockdowns on restaurants, bars, fitness centers. People are afraid to fly because of the pandemic. If we begin to get a grip on the pandemic, if the vaccines start to turn that curve, then you're going to be able to, all these local communities will be able to lift these restrictions, and then the waiters at the restaurants can go back. That's really the heart of the problem. And at least we're sort of compensating a lot of these people for lost wages. That's helping a little bit. But I really think a lot is going to happen once we feel like we got this behind us. Because this is a healthcare problem. It's a healthcare issue. We have a medical answer, and the medical answer appears to be quite effective.
Jim Glassman, you are living this in your Los Angeles right now. I'm going to call it hardest hit in America. I want to go back to Blanchard and Summers on this jobs day, their very famous paper of 1986 on hysteresis. Tell us about the hysteresis of Los Angeles, and if we get the service sector back, do you just assume that we get the inflation back that gets us back to a normal labor economy?
I don't think inflation comes back that quickly, because really all that's going on here is we've lost ground. All this fiscal money that's being spent is really just trying to keep people semi-whole. And unless all these actions propel the economy way
but
beyond.
Jim, I don't mean to interrupt, but I have to interrupt you, Jim. You're one of the best we know on this. Do you just assume further income replacement and income substitution to keep Los Angeles and, frankly, the rest of the nation back on its feet?
Well, in the first round, they did a pretty good job of this.
Yes.
And this is why you saw this consumer spending back to normal for everybody across the income spectrum. But I think the problem is, I really think we're going to get our hands around this particular crisis. But as you have been pointing out for a while, the real challenge in America is that there's a lot of transformation going on here. Innovation is displacing a lot of jobs. This crisis is propelling people from brick and mortar to online. And there's a lot of jobs in those industries that are disappearing. So not everybody wants to be driving for Amazon. So the the problem really at its core is the income divide is really about technology and all the disruption that comes from that. It's a wonderful thing for productivity and for companies that are on the front lines of this, and this is why the equity market does what it does. But for Americans, this is a really disruptive thing. I really think that's a bigger issue than the pandemic challenges can be manageable, and I really think the next round or two, we're gonna feel more comfortable about that.
Jim Glassman, stay healthy. James Glassman at JP Morgan Chase in commercial banking. They're just thrilled to have him with us on this jobs day. Futures up 12, Dow futures up 95. Even the NASDAQ, I mean, the levels, Francine, I'm losing touch on the levels. 3,800 SPX, 31,000 Dow. We're going to get a 13,000 NASDAQ 100 here in a bit. Extraordinary.
Extraordinary. And the focus, of course, is not only on the reflationary trade, but, you know, I think more stability from U.S. politics.
Should we stop talking? Bitcoin's going to give us 42,000 in a minute. It is Jobs Day, not on Bitcoin. We'll speak with Ellen Zentner of Morgan Stanley. She's just been absolutely wonderful. A cautious view on the GDP rebound. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.
Se logra una sonrisa de parte de cada persona que utiliza el dispositivo, ya que se pone en situación, entre comillas, de una persona discapacitada. Y ven que lo sorteamos de una forma agradable, porque el simple hecho de sentarse en un dispositivo ya es agradable.
Nace MAT como una solución de movilidad a personas con discapacidad, nace Mandados como una opción de generación de ingresos y nace MAT Tools como generación de ingresos y educación a las demás personas que no están en silla.
I am David Weston. Bloomberg Television is reinventing one of the most iconic brands in financial television for a new audience. Join me to see the news program for the clever investor. This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Ritika Gupta with your Bloomberg Business Flash. Credit Suisse expects to report a loss in the fourth quarter. The Swiss bank is setting aside another $850 million to cover potential settlements related to residential mortgage-backed securities. That's more than twice the amount Credit Suisse had suggested last month. Boeing has agreed to settle a criminal fraud charge over the 737 MAX by paying $2.5 billion. The Justice Department had accused the plane maker of defrauding the government by concealing information about the jet. The 737 MAX was involved in 2 fatal crashes that killed 346 people. And that is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Tom?
Ritika, thanks so much. The data's simple. The future's up 13, and we'll do that through the morning to Jobs Day. The Washington Post moments ago publishes through the Johns Hopkins University that there were 4,000 deaths yesterday in America. I hate to say it, Francine, but it's a hugely important statistic framed around the deaths of September 11th, 2001. It was unimaginable at 3,000. And to pass that landmark of the number of deaths in one day on 9/11, and now to see the shock of a 4,000 statistic really shows the virulence, if you will, of this pandemic.
Yeah. Also shows, Tom, the disconnect between what's happening in the real world right now with, even here in London,
Absolutely.
1 in 30 people having COVID, hospitals at the brink because there are too many infected, there are too many dying, and yet stocks at a record high. So this disconnect, and we know the story, we know it's about, stimulus, we know that central banks are there, but you just wonder exactly how it will end up. But stocks rising, U.S. futures also edging higher despite these record number of deaths and infection. If you look at Bitcoin dropping after topping 40,000, but it's very clear that, for example, European shares, Tom, are heading for the best week since November. Up next, we look at U.S. politics with Richard Haass on the Council on Foreign Relations.
Valuations, particularly, sort of the technology landscape, have gotten to some pretty extraordinary levels. So I think it's not a surprise. I don't think it's any indication of the beginning of the end, but I do think markets don't like uncertainty.
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
The United States has squandered its moral authority.
It's quite clear to the public that this is a president who has actively encouraged this kind of behavior, because if he hadn't, it wouldn't take place.
This is not a case where you're dealing with something that came with no warning or there was no intelligence. If you open the newspaper over the last week, you saw they were boasting about coming to Washington, to use the president's word, going wild.
Don't dare call them protesters. They were a riotous mob, insurrectionists, domestic terrorists.
Certainly the people who did it are responsible for their own actions, but I think the president needs to do some introspection as to whether or not what he did yesterday contributed to it, what his family did.
Business leaders who gave money to this man repeatedly when it was known, or they should have known, where this would end, not only financed him, supported him, believing that they would enrich themselves. And I find it really very, very disappointing behavior.
American democracy will survive, and none of our leaders will be intimidated.
He unleashed an all-out assault on our institutions of our democracy from the outset. And yesterday was but the culmination of that unrelenting attack.
I joined the Senate Democratic leader in calling on the Vice President to remove this president by immediately invoking the 25th Amendment.
As to the 25th Amendment being invoked, I do not believe that's appropriate at this point.
Rika Yoshida and our video team, with that incredible string of voices, we're thrilled that our team has done such a good job of moving the conversation forward. It was my book of the summer. It's the book of your weekend. You need one book to read to get through what has been wrought over the last number of days. And it is The World by Richard Haas. I can't say enough about the importance of this book then and the importance of this book this weekend. Ambassador Haas joins us from the Council on Foreign Relations. Richard Haas, you talk about the essential history. Here's the history from John Fenby. There was the Paris Commune of 1870 whatever. We saw the Washington Commune this week. How do we extract ourselves and move forward from the Washington Commune that was wrought?
Look, it's the right question, Tom. It's going to be a long, long road back, almost like a person's reputation. A country's reputation takes a long time to build and a very short time to undermine. We saw the undermining the other day. I think in the short run, you've got to hold people to account. That's where law enforcement, the judicial system comes in. You can't do things like this and get away with it scot-free. Then we've got to take a step back and look at the context that allowed this to grow up. That's everything from social media, a lack of civics education. We've got to look at the economic context, a lack of opportunity. I think there needs to be a profound soul-searching and reckoning in American society.
You, more than anyone I know in America, had to live through Northern Ireland of a violent time. We moved from the violence of Northern Ireland to a peace. What part did the judicial system play in that? And do you just assume we're going to see arrests and a judicial process that will help heal us?
It's a really interesting parallel, Tom. What worked in Northern Ireland were two things. One was the rule of law. What the Provisional IRA and other people had to learn is they could not shoot their way into power. British Army, police, what have you, essentially made it impossible for them to realize their political aims with violence. But secondly, and it was important, they had to be offered a real, legitimate, alternative political path. So for this country, we've got to be serious about law enforcement, serious about law and order. Those who break the law need to be held to account. But we need to make sure there are economic and political paths in this country for reform. Economic, I've already mentioned. Politically, we really need to look at how we reform our political system also, so moderates have a voice. Our primary system, our funding, our media, all favor radicalization.
Richard, good morning from London. Can the president really pardon himself?
Look, it's a gray area whether he can self-pardon or not. Obviously, if all the rumors are true, he's going to explore it. It won't necessarily protect him from what happens then in New York State or other states. It also won't necessarily shield him from congressional investigations. It may or may not, depending on what the Supreme Court would rule, protect him from the consequences. But the investigations, I believe, will go ahead regardless.
Is the romance now between Donald Trump and the Republican Party truly over?
No, I think that's one of the real questions where the Republican Party goes. The fact that you still the other night, after the events of January 6th, still had Republican congressmen and senators questioning without any evidence whatsoever the election results tell you that the Republican Party, or elements of it, to be more accurate, are afraid to tackle Donald Trump. They're worried about his power over cable, over social media, his power in the base of the Republican Party, which is what comes out in votes in primaries. So I think the question is whether the Republican Party can expunge this radical element. If not, does it coexist? You essentially have two Republican parties. Do you ultimately bring about a real conservative party? I think that has to play out.
Dr. Haas, there's a history of this in America. I'm not going to wax philosophical in the 19th century on a Friday, but we can stagger from Huey Long to Joe McCarthy out to the radicalism that you just mentioned as well. It seems that when the leader drifts away, the moment drifts away for the radicals. If President Trump gets out 1 month, 6 months, a year out into being a private citizen, does his movement drift away?
But we also live in a society, Tom, where people now have access to media that we never historically had on a large scale. He's also got enormous sums of money, the war chest he's built up over the last couple of months. So I think it's wrong to assume he's going to disappear. The real question is, how do we make it costly for people to support it? One interesting question will be the Josh Hawleys, the Ted Cruzes, and others who are very associated with the political moves of the last few days, who have been enablers all along. Do they pay a political price at the ballot box? Do they become unacceptable? If not to Republicans, do they become unacceptable to a broad enough electorate so people who are associated with Trump cannot get elected? That remains to be seen.
What does the middle ground of the GOP do? I mean, President Bush came out with extensive comments as well, and, other people of the middle, and Ambassador, I'm going to put you in that group as well. What has to be the proactive response of middle Republicans to what we've seen?
Look, they've got to support one another. They've got to articulate a real, I believe, conservative alternative, one that goes back to Ronald Reagan and others, to basically remind themselves why they became Republicans in the first place. And they've got to challenge financially, politically, rhetorically, you name it, these radicals, and basically expose them for the reality that they are not conservatives. And the question is, what does it mean to be a Republican now in the third decade of the 21st century? And that's a fight that has to happen.
Richard, has the country always been this divided in the U.S., but we just didn't see it because there was no one to rally them? Or is this just a completely different society we're dealing with? Like, how many people in the U.S. right now think this election was illegitimate?
You still have tens of millions, I don't know if it's 30 million or 50 million people who question the legitimacy of this election. So I think it's, to some extent, both. What we haven't had is a president of the United States, if you will, from the inside, leading or instigating this questioning of American institutions, norms, and all that. I think that's qualitatively different. He's not some outsider somewhere. This is not Rush Limbaugh. This is the president of the United States. But also, there is a large critical mass of Americans who feel that this country has been biased and balanced against them. They resent elites. They resent the advantages of others. They feel they themselves haven't had opportunities economically, socially, politically, whatever. And I think that's a much larger number. Plus, now they have the ability to communicate with one another because of this decentralized media system we have.
Richard, thank you so much. Richard Haas there, Ambassador Haas, President of the Council on Foreign Relations, and of course, author of The World, a brief introduction. If you haven't picked it up, it's a great read, a short read as well. Now let's get straight to the Bloomberg First Word News in New York City. Here's Ritika Gupta. Hi, Ritika.
Hi, Francine. A day after he urged his angry supporters to take action, President Trump condemned the storming of the U.S. Capitol. In a video released last night, the president accused the mob of defiling the seat of U.S. democracy. He also said said he would now turn his focus to ensuring a smooth, orderly and seamless transition of power. A Capitol Police officer has died of injuries suffered when a pro-Trump mob stormed the building. Authorities say the officer was hurt whilst engaging with protesters. Meanwhile, the chief of the Capitol Police has resigned. The force has come under fire for lack of preparation. And President Trump is preparing a sweeping list of pardons for his final days in office. Bloomberg's learned the list includes senior White House officials, family members, prominent rappers, and possibly himself. The president's legal power to pardon himself isn't made clear in the Constitution, though. And coronavirus deaths in the U.S. are likely to maintain a near-record pace through January. According to the CDC, the U.S. will end the month averaging about 2,600 deaths a day. By the time Joe Biden is inaugurated January the 20th, the nation's death toll is likely to surpass 400,000. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ruchika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. Tom Francine.
Ruchika, thank you so much. Now, we're just getting a headline from the UK. This is after we were also updated from the Commission President about extra vaccines available to the EU. This is the UK now saying, Tom, they've secured some 5 million doses of the Moderna coronavirus vaccine. This is according to a statement, I believe, from Downing Street. And we saw the rhetoric really from Boris Johnson yesterday really ramp up, Tom, promising a lot more vaccines, promising, of course, for them to be distributed quickly. After all the controversy we saw about giving the first dose, but then waiting 3 months for the second dose, which a lot of, there's scientific evidence that that may not be the right way forward.
Well, it'll be interesting to see, and certainly from the experts we've talked to, it's not only the acquisition of doses, but Francine, it's the idea that you've got to get them the last mile, where you've really got to get the distribution out to multiple nodes to get things done. We're up, futures up 13, Dow futures up 93. It is Jobs Day in America. We'll go beneath the headline data at 8:30, and we will speak of this political week. Joining us on Bloomberg Radio, Chris Christie, the former governor of New Jersey. Chris Christie on Washington. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.